with the roll call.
Yes. So we have Ramsey Stevens,
Present.
Matthew Portilla,
I'm here.
Ryan O'Blander,
Here.
Eric Jeffers,
I'm here.
and David Sims.
Present.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, was there one more who's not present, or was that all of them?
That is all of them, to my knowledge.
Okay, great. All right, moving forward with the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's see here, I'll just randomly pick someone. Mr. Portillo, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. Sorry, getting off mute here. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America.
and to the
To the
republic
republic for which it stands,
one nation,
one nation,
under God,
under God,
with liberty and justice.
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you for that. Are there any additions, deletions, or reordering on the agenda, Suhey?
No.
Okay, let's give a warm welcome then to our new board member. I believe that's Mr. Jeffers, am I correct?
Yes, that's right. This is my
That
first
is
board meeting.
correct.
All right, do we actually have a presentation, or we're just gonna let you just introduce yourself?
Oh,
Say hi.
this is Ed Liberty. So let me jump in and introduce the subject matter, and then I'll turn it over to Horizons Energy to talk about the integrated resource plan. So I'll tee it up with a brief few words, maybe not so brief, but about why we're here and what the purpose of this exercise is, and what we hope it will yield. So first of all, we're working on an integrated resource plan, and there's some folks on the committee may wonder, well, what is an integrated resource plan? So I'll provide a brief explanation of that. In 2018, we undertook a resource plan, and you may ask, well, what's the difference between a resource plan and an integrated resource plan? Well, a resource plan that we looked at in 2018 was merely looking at what generation resources and transmission resources we need for our utility looking forward. An integrated resource plan, or often referred to as an IRP, takes a look not just at supply side resources, but it brings into the equation, if you will, demand side resources, things like conservation or demand response, which is a technology, or a grouping of technologies and management tools for system operations. So what is a resource plan in itself? So it's merely a utility looking out into the future. They're typically done at a minimum of 10-year look aheads. Some companies will go further, as long as 20 years or more, in planning for what kind of power plant or power generation, in this case, integrating demand response resources you might want to have in order to meet your load. For the large utilities, these are required to be done annually by the Public Service Commission, which is not unusual around the country. Many public service commissions or Board of Public Utility commissioners will require that of the utilities they regulate. In our case, we're small enough that it's not strictly required, although recognizing that we did not have a plan in 2018, I engaged at that time Horizons Energy through Power Engineers. It was doing some other work for us that was all supply side resource related, evaluating the condition of our power plant, what it might cost to build various types of plants. We decided to have a resource plan at that time. Fast forward to where we are today. It's 4 years since we did the last plan. It's, even though we're not required to do it annually, it's worthy of a discussion and going ahead and doing it. The 2018 plan called for a number of things which we've in fact been moving forward on. One of them was a second tie line, and we're moving forward with that. We're well into the engineering process. Some of the material procurement has begun. We've executed various agreements with FPL. We will be executing further agreements with FPL with regards to that line. We're getting ready from a compliance point of view to be ready to accept that interconnection and be certified by CERC and by the FERC to in fact operate a second tie line. We went ahead and made significant commitments to solar energy to the tune of 36.5 megawatts, 36.55 megawatts under the FMPA solar contracts. These are all things that were identified in that 2018 resource plan. In case of solar, we actually went beyond what the resource plan suggested. I think that resource plan, if memory serves me correct, had suggested around 25 megawatts, and we actually went to 36.55 because the projects were so attractive. And we actually took on enough solar to completely fill the daylight hours during the shoulder months of the year. So about 6 months of the year, the combination of nuclear plus solar will fully meet our daytime load. The next threshold is where we go after that, perhaps even batteries. So the integrated resource plan is an opportunity for us to shape our future as a utility in terms of what we want to do. Resource plans are not new in the utility industry. They've been used for many, many decades, and I mean many decades. However, the focus across the country has always been least cost planning. So resource plans were typically approached from a least cost planning point of view. So what is the cheapest way, if you will, and the most diverse way in terms of fuel diversity, because utilities were not disposed to have too much of their generation portfolio in one specific basket of fuels, whether it was nuclear or coal or oil or gas or hydro. There was a mix. So utilities have wanted to have a mix of resources. They've wanted to have multiple power plants as opposed to just one power plant, obviously for reliability purposes. And it was always driven by an underpinning of least cost planning. What has evolved in recent years is less and less of a concern for cost, which doesn't mean that it's been thrown overboard, but more recognition for environmental attributes, lower carbon, and meeting the expectations of the public. So more and more of the utility plans are looking in terms of resources, acknowledging that solar energy, for example, is a viable technology to embrace and build into the portfolio. Long story short, it says that there's really no wrong answer in a resource plan. The resource plan belongs to the community. It belongs to the utility in the case of an investor-owned community, but even the investor-owned communities do bend and shape their views to what the community and the stakeholders are expecting. In Lake Worth Beach, we have a little bit of an advantage in that the shareholder is the community, right? So you as representatives of the community have the ability to provide input to what you would like to see in our resources going forward. You are going to help shape that. So there's an important opportunity. And as you do that, as you think about what you want to do, you seek the counsel of people in the community, people in the industry, and allow that input into the process. We don't want to shut anybody out from having input to the process. Now, there may be some ideas that prove to be completely unrealistic, and there may be some that are very, very realistic. The key is to come out with a resource plan that is realistic, it's time-bound, it identifies the costs and recognizes that those costs will have to be recovered somehow through electric rates going forward, regardless of what options are chosen. So you as a group here are an important position to really influence what that resource plan would look like. What's the role of Horizons Energy in all of this? Horizons Energy is really the moderator, facilitator of the process, and they have the ability to model, and you're going to see a lot of that in the next 45 minutes or so when they go through their presentation of how extensive and how detailed that modeling can be. so you can have an appreciation for what the impact of various scenarios is going to be, whether we're looking at high natural gas costs, low natural gas costs, rapid development of alternate technologies, what those might cost, market macroeconomics, all of these things factor in. But they will model multiple scenarios for us based on the types of resources that you all feel are important to have in our mix going forward. We do have planned unit retirements coming up, which is another reason why we would want to do this. Our coal portfolio, or the portion of our portfolio that's associated with coal, which is the FMPA Stanton unit, is scheduled to be retired by the end of 2025. That remains on track. And of course, we have a second tie line coming in. And when the second tie line comes in, it'll allow us to retire some of our older assets. That doesn't mean we're going to close the power plant, but it allows us to retire some very, very expensive steam generation that's frankly well beyond end of life anyway. So we're in a position to begin looking out into the future now and making some decisions. We're not in a crisis situation. Our current resources are adequate for the next few years, but we should be putting pen to paper or pencil to paper with a good eraser if we want to modify the plan to talk about what we're going to do as Stanton 1, the coal unit, gets retired at the end of 2025. So right now we envision that capacity loss will be absorbed in large part, if not totally, by all the new solar that we've contracted for. But also a good portion of the steam that we have retiring would then be absorbed by that solar we've contracted for as well. So that's the high level overview of why we're all here. You do get continuing education units from me for listening to my speech, but hopefully you all have a sense of why you're here and participating in this process. Before I turn it over to Horizons, do you all have any questions of me?
I'll open the floor to anyone who has questions. I don't know if we have the raise hand thing working, but if you want to raise hand while you're muted, I can see the list. I don't see anyone unmuting or raising their hand, so.
Okay.
I'm unmuting if I can figure out how to do it.
There you go.
It looks like Matt has raised his hand, or he did, and then it went away.
I apologize. It was an error.
And also, Commissioner, for the record, because it may be public out there, certainly recorded, please, as whether it's you or anybody else, please introduce yourselves as you speak so the public knows who's speaking.
Sounds like a very good idea. This is Commissioner and now Vice Mayor Christopher McFoy. Some of you on the EUAB already know me as one of the commissioners who's more technically inclined and very focused on the utility, both from a consumer standpoint and a environmental standpoint. I guess the comment I might make is Ed gave a good introduction of some of the IRP things. I might be a bit more broad in scope of what an IRP can do for a utility and what some of the objectives of this commission are. Director Liberty already alluded to the importance of what our fuel sources are, whether they're and the shift to renewables, which for our case is primarily solar. I think I would broaden a little bit the economic aspect that we just approved as a commission, somewhat under, I guess, under duress of fossil fuel gas prices, almost a 20% increase in the price. And we were informed that we may be looking at further increases. So as we look to renewables, it's not only for environmental reasons, it's very much for economic reasons of locking in some price stability against inevitable price increases of any form of fossil fuel that will be coming. I would also encourage the group to think as broadly as possible, look to other IRPs, some of the most progressive ones around the country, and look at best practices. People are thinking about quite different ways of funding utilities. And I would say that our look at the IRP should be both technical, how we do both supply and demand, but also thinking broadly about how we fund. And I'll leave it at that for the moment.
So this is Ed Liberty. Let me add to that and follow up. Those are very, very good comments. We view solar, particularly solar and the power purchase agreements that we have, as a hedge against rising fuel costs. It of course has tremendous environmental benefits as well, which we're not discounting that for a moment at all. But the effectively, when you look at our ability to get power from solar, it displaces power that we would have otherwise bought from a fossil fuel source. If you work backwards through it, you could say that we'll be hedging basically to somewhere near a $5 and change natural gas price. Today, natural gas prices are in the $8, $9, and $10 range, and we paid as much as $15 last week in our gas calculations for power purchase purposes. So every kilowatt hour that we can get from a much lower price, in this case, currently in the market, solar source or any other renewable source, is effectively offsetting that price of gas from our portfolio going forward. At a very, very high level, once our FMPA projects all come online, we will be in the neighborhood of 55% or so free of carbon fuels in our portfolio on a total annual basis, which is certainly going in the right direction. And we want to go further. And we view solar as being one of those resources in order to do that. And of course, demand response, if it proves to be viable, would help do that as well. Although that actually comes with a decrease in delivery of energy to a customer. But be it as it may, solar is a very attractive hedge, physical hedge, not a financial hedge. It's a physical hedge against rising natural gas prices, which I'm very confident that people who sit in all of these chairs 10 years, 15 and 20 years from now will be very happy that we did that. And even happier if we go further. So I'll leave it at that. So at this point, if there's do we have any other questions or comments?
Yes.
Director, sorry, Chairman, was that Mr. Oberlander?
I was going to say that Mr. Stevens had his hand up, so.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I just wanted to ask a technical question about the $5 number you just cited as our functional cost for our solar power, and by extension, our hedged price, if you will. Is that inclusive of capacity, or is that just for the power cost?
That is a very, very round number of power costs, and I'm not at liberty to disclose the actual details. That's a confidential number within our power contract. So use something that's directionally accurate, but does not disclose the confidential price of power.
Okay, I fully appreciate it. Is there a rounded number that you could give us for what that number would be inclusive of capacity? Because correct me if I'm wrong, the $15 number you cited for our natural gas, and I recognize that was a high-end number from last week, but that $15 number is inclusive of capacity, is it not?
No, it's not. That's a gas number.
Okay. Are you able to give us? Yeah. Okay.
Hold on. That was the cost of gas delivered into the market zone, I believe Wednesday or Thursday of last week, as an example. It hasn't been that high that I'm aware of, and we pulled up some historical numbers, but we've been running in the range of $8 to $12, $13 for the past few weeks. Now we're hoping this is a market anomaly, but that's an actual gas number, dollars per million BTU gas delivered into the market. The number of $5 I back into, and looking at that and say, hey, if we had solar, more solar, or the solar we have coming online, it effectively would have capped that at around $5. So we could have reduced that energy in the range of let's say $5.50 a million BTU equivalent on the fuel side, energy only, not capacity. And
Okay.
solar,
Yeah.
solar is a very, very difficult technology to take capacity credit for, because, you know, it may sound overly simplistic, but it doesn't work when the sun doesn't shine. So we can't take 100% credit for solar.
But we could hypothetically, as we go into this IRP process, take into account the value of, even if it's marginal, that marginal capacity value, could we not?
Absolutely can. And Horizons can guide us on that. And there is some market norms and what's done. You know, right. I've typically seen numbers in the range of 30 to 50% of the nameplate value of being a reasonable capacity number. There's no incentive to overestimate it on the high side, because if you get it wrong, you wind up being short of capacity, which is not acceptable.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that gets to the question that I'm definitely not asking you to answer right now, but the ultimate question that I want to get to in this process is, hypothetically, if we had 100% solar power, and I'm not counting the demand side for the moment, but if our supply side was 100% solar, or even in excess of 100%, what does the premia, not just premium, but the myriad of premia for the necessary capacity add in terms of cost, right? You know what? Because to me, obviously we have to solve for both capacity and power. So I just think the clearer we can have an understanding of what our, kind of, forgive the term, hell or high water capacity costs are as we work through this process, maybe the more creative we will all be able to be.
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. The first thing you have to appreciate for the listening public is that we have 22 megawatts of nuclear capacity in our portfolio, which produces about 38% of our energy needs. So I would not want to go 100% solar, because what we'd have to do then is basically dump in the market the stuff that we've already bought under contracts, because we were part owner in the plant, right? So it has a very, very low marginal rate to run. So I would not recommend that we walk away from, a plant that's producing 38% of our energy in a carbon-free mode. So if we just take the balance of the power that we need then, which is the other, let's call it, it's called 58% or 60, roughly 60% of the power that we need. That's the portion of the book of the portfolio, if you will, that would be eligible for replacement with solar. But then what you have to then take into account further is that, well, of that let's call it 60% for argument's sake, that 60%, a large portion of that is actually needed at night. So you're not going to get solar at night unless you develop battery storage to produce solar during the day and store it so that you can then use it at night, right? So we have already bought so much solar that's what we're up against. So if you look at, and I know you haven't seen these, but we'll get into this modeling maybe not tonight, but the next meeting. We have bought so much solar that there'll be hours of the day when we're oversubscribed, meaning we'll have more solar coming at us than we have a customer to deliver it to. Now, that's not a huge number. It's a very, very small number. It's in the range of 1,500 to 3,000 megawatt hours a year. And I don't have any doubt that we couldn't sell it into the market, especially this market, at these prices and readily cover our costs. But the point is that, and you'll see this as we go through the resource plan, that in order to take on more solar, it's going to have to be coupled with batteries, or understanding that we're going to be net producers, net sellers into the markets, which puts us into a different mode than we've been in the past. That doesn't mean we can't do it, but that's something to be appreciated. I fully expect that battery technology.
Director. Yeah.
I fully expect that battery technology is going to be a very big part of our future, not just for Lake Worth Beach, but for all of Florida.
And Director, I very much appreciate all that. And I would just challenge my fellow board members, and then I'll be quiet for the time being, is if we can figure out a way to be net producers and have that be profitable for our community, meaning that there is more money at the end of the day coming into and staying in Lake Worth Beach, I think we should try to run towards that goal as fast as we possibly can.
And I believe Mr. Jeffers has his hand up, and then maybe I could add one thing
To that
too.
point of
Yeah.
that was an explicit part of the strategy that we employed in signing on to as much solar as we did under those FMPA contracts, because I and others predicted that those numbers would easily clear the market, so we were not worried about overproduction. And we wanted to pursue a laddered portfolio of FMPA Solar 1, FMPA Solar 2, and later on FMPA Solar 3, 4, 5, as it doesn't have to be FMPA, but further evolutions, because we thought the technology would continue to evolve and we'd have more players in the market, which is in fact proving to be true. So we've already started down that path. And I'll point out that being a net seller, or being a seller of energy as a city, is not a new concept. The city, in fact, started doing that in the 1970s. And there are people working here today that joined the company for the purpose of selling power, and we're selling power and system operations. Today, that's an entirely different picture. We're not a net seller. We're a net buyer. We buy 98+% of the power that we consume in the city. But on occasion, we do sell, but it's not until the market is very, very expensive. And unfortunately, at the moment, our cost to sell is really just offsetting expenses, because on an annual basis, the plant is I'm not going to say a net. It's a significant expense that we're paying for reliability. We're just reducing our operating costs by selling when the market's very, very high, but it's not enough to pay for the cost of operating the unit year round.
If I could jump in just with a short comment, it seems to me that we need to be a bit careful in how we think about some of this, in the sense, and here's what I'm thinking about. All of us on the call, I'm sure, understand and have seen the daily curves of a solar panel, that it's roughly a bell-shaped curve, and it goes to zero for a significant part of the day, the 24 hours. But even during the day, it's not constant. And my understanding, when we say that we've bought, say, 36 odd megawatt hours, that's the capacity of the field to generate at full tilt. Like our solar field at the landfill is about a 1.5, 1.7 megawatt field. That's under best sun conditions. The rest of the time, it's less than that. So when we think about, okay, the nuke plant, the St. Lucie plant puts out whatever it is, 22 megawatts, you can't straight add the 36 megawatts of the solar and say, okay, 36 plus 22, if our demand, say, is only 40 that day, well, we've got extra. We've only got extra for that little period of the day when it's running at peak. The rest of the day, we're short. So it seems to me we want to be thinking really about, and I always mix up my physics units, but we want to be thinking about megawatt hours rather than just megawatts. And because solar, that's one of the complications of a non-steady, a variable energy resource. It's possible to deal with, and batteries would be wonderful. Then you don't have to think about that. But in the meantime, we do have to think about it.
I think I'll put some very important numbers to help guide you. And these are not, I'm going to be off by a few, up and plus or minus 10%, right? Or plus or minus 5%. But over the course of the year, we require about 480,000 megawatt hours. So just write down 480,000 megawatt hours is what the city requires. And that's growing anywhere between 0.5% to 2% annually, generally speaking. That's megawatt hours. 38% of those megawatt hours are coming from nuclear. So that 22 megawatt nameplate rating produces 38% of our megawatt hours because it operates at a 96+% capacity factor. That means that it produces 22 megawatts every hour, 96% of the time. So that's how you get those numbers. The balance is coming under our other fixed entitlements. Let's say about 7 or 8% is coming from the Stanton unit. Now, the Stanton unit does not always run on coal. It's true that it's a coal unit, but it also burns a significant amount of natural gas. And it's scheduled for retirement. And then the balance, let's say 50 to 52%, is coming from our supplemental agreement with OUC. That's and when we think in terms of an IRP looking forward 10, 15, or 20 years, that doesn't mean that we're going to have this same OUC contract 20 years. It only has another three years or so left on it, right? So we have to think beyond that. We're not planning for the next 3 years. We're really planning for the next decade. Where are we going or more, right? So but we have to assume that something like that will exist. It may not be with OUC because it's a competitively sourced product, but that's what we have. So we're really trying to fill megawatt hours going forward for supply, but we also have to have capacity. And the way that I explain capacity energy to people is capacity is the reason you don't put your finger in the socket. Energy is what happens when you do put your finger in the socket, right? You always have to have enough capacity there to meet your load. And that's why we don't take full credit for solar. But we're going to have to decide how much credit for solar we will take in the future. But the commissioner is correct. The 36.55 megawatts of solar that we've contracted for is really not the same as the 22 megawatts of nuclear we've contracted for, because it only produces 36.55 on its peak day. And then we know that each year it's going to degrade by about 0.3 to 0.5% in terms of its ability to generate power. It's just a natural degradation of a solar panel. So it's a complex formula. It's one of those simultaneous differential equations you have to solve for, I would think. But it's not impossible to do. And that's where Horizons comes in to help us explain to us what our options could be, and then model different scenarios that you'd be interested in.
Right. This is board member Eric Jeffers. That was a great segue into what my question was, which is, does the Horizons energy plan that we're about to see include a good model and exploration of energy storage at like the grid edge?
Well, I'll start to answer, then I'll turn it over to Horizons, to Greg Turk. But I know that the model will look at various scenarios, and it does include looking at storage. It does look at what storage prices may come down to as that technology evolves. It takes all of that into account. It'll look at storage from the context of a macro, meaning not necessarily at the edge of the grid, but incorporating storage into the portfolio.
Okay.
What that could do. We are interested in looking at storage at the grid edge, but at the moment, the tax laws are not favorable to storage at the grid edge. They're favorable to storage that's co-located and co-built with solar at the same time. So co-sited and co-constructed with solar. At the moment, the tax laws do not give the investment tax credit and the accelerated depreciation to battery storage that is not built with solar. So that would take away from one of the benefits of the grid edge. The other thing to just think about in terms of energy prices, marginal energy prices, what we're talking about, electricity prices. The way to simply look at that is to take what is a modern, more efficient power plants in the marketplace, which are probably operating at about, let's say, at about 7,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour, or 7,500 BTU per kilowatt hour. Let's call it 7,500 or so. And you multiply that times the fuel price. So let's say a fuel price, let's say like $5 gas. Okay. If you take $5 gas times a 7,500 heat rate unit, you're looking at somewhere around $37.50 as the cost of power. Just the cost of the energy, not capacity. So if you look at the market and say, gee, as long as I buy solar at less than $37 a megawatt hour, right, I've probably hedged myself against gas prices going up beyond $5, right? That's kind of the very, very rough math for conversational purposes that you can use. How did I come up with a 7,500 heat rate? Just by looking at the types of turbines that the big, big power companies in the state are installing their newest units. Their older units are probably in the 9,000 heat rate range. So as long as you can buy solar probably under $40 a megawatt hour, and we have, you're gonna beat the market with gas prices that are much above $5, $5.50. So you may wind up overpaying slightly if gas prices go below $5.50, but I would look forward to the day when gas prices get back to that number. And even if they do, remember that part of the reason why we did this was the environmental benefits as well, right? So it's hard to put a dollar value on that, although certainly Horizons can share information on what carbon pricing may be in the future and various assumptions we could use if a carbon price becomes a reality in North America or in Florida. All right. I think I've dumped a lot of information on you in the first 37 minutes of the call. Are there any other questions before I turn it over to Horizons, who will lead us through the modeling function? And the last
I was
thing
going to say, I think we kind of jumped a gun. Did the new member introduce himself at all?
I did.
You did?
My name's Eric Jeffers. I'm happy to be here.
Sorry,
I'm the
I
new board
apologize.
member. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you for calling that out. Appreciate it.
Maybe, Eric, you could give a little background on your expertise or so, and interest in being on the board might be helpful to other folks. Maybe you did that and I didn't hear it because I might have gotten on a little late.
No, I certainly did not do that, and I can absolutely do it now. I'm Eric Jeffers. I live in Lake Worth, obviously. I'm on the board. I'm an electrical engineer, went to college for that, did it for a little bit. Now I'm a software engineer, and I'm here to just help be on the board. Yeah, that's the highlights. I'm just interested in seeing this presentation.
So as we go through this, and you see numbers or information put up there by Horizons, I'll just point out that we fed them some numbers to start with, but those numbers are subject to change by community input. Certainly I'll provide input, but this is really the community's desires that should be in the resource plan, right? So what's in there now is let's consider it a straw man for demonstrating how the model might work. And then they'll walk you through the things, or I'll mention the things where you should provide some input as a group. And by the way, you don't have to make those decisions tonight. But we want you to start thinking about what should be in there. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Greg Turk or the Horizons team to speak to the subject. And I'm assuming that they'll have the ability to share their screen. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Turk, and I'm an executive consultant with Horizons Energy. It's good to jump in the middle of the spirited discussion, and I'll try to tie in the work that we're looking to do with Lake Worth Beach in the coming weeks and couple of months to some of the comments that were mentioned here. I've got to say at the outset that I have had, after a couple of years of very good internet connection, I've had internet connection problems today. I was dropped off once during this call. If I am disconnected, I'm being joined by Kathy Jones, who's helping, or I'm helping her with this project. We're working together on it. And so if need be, she can pick up where I leave off if I'm disconnected again. The things we want to step through are Horizons Energy, a little bit about who we are, about our background and experience in doing this kind of work. We're going to step through resource planning process itself. As Ed mentioned, we worked with Lake Worth Beach in 2018 to develop a resource plan. And so we'll compare the 2018 plan to the 2022 plan. And along the ways, we look to answer questions that you might have. Horizons Energy was founded in 2016. I founded the company, although both Kathy and myself have, each of us have over 30 years of experience in power planning problems. I have myself worked on over 25 different integrated resource plans in my career. We also spend significant time thinking about and producing services around power markets, and that is the buying and selling of power, both within very formal markets as well as the more informal or less administered markets such as Florida.
Greg?
Think.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, you're in.
Well, I don't know if I should share my screen now instead of him.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better way to go since his screen is locking up. Are you able to share your screen?
Yes, I am. And
Okay.
so I will go here. Am I sharing yet?
Well, we got the established 2016
Okay,
slide.
share. Okay. Okay. You see my screen now?
Yep, you're back at the beginning of the slides.
Okay, cool. Yeah, damn. All right, it's not wanting to advance. All right. So I think he was here. So
Yes.
we have worked with numerous clients, including developers, banks, utilities, municipalities, cities, and some of the co-ops across the country. We offer 3 services, one being what we are going to say is Encompass. Encompass is the software that we use to develop our energy prices, and it's also the software that we'll use to conduct the integrated resource plan for Lake Worth Beach. But we develop a national database that covers the region that you see here. So we're doing the lower 48, 7 Canadian provinces, as well as Baja, Mexico. So when we're developing our energy prices, there are 78 market areas here. So we're running the Encompass model and developing those prices at each one of these bubbles that you see here. So the bubbles represent the market areas and the lines represent the transmission interface between the individual areas. So when you see these dotted lines, that's showing the DC lines between SPP and the WEC region. Well, and I say SPP, that's the Southwest Power Pool, and then the Western Electric Interconnect. Oh, wrong direction. Well, it doesn't want to go the other way for me. So as Greg said, we both have over 30 years of experience. He is the founder of Electric Power of Horizons Energy. We both have recently, we've been engaged by AES Indiana for their integrated resource plan, as well as Public Service New Mexico. And in MPP, we're actually working with Public Service New Mexico on updating their integrated resource plan. We also worked with Associated Electric cooperatives to produce uncertainty analyses that they're using in their integrated resource plan. And we worked with the Kentucky Municipal Electric Energy Agency on their integrated resource plan. We have a lot of experience. So our background is we've been in the consulting arena. Greg started out working at a public utility commission. I started out at an investor-owned utility, but since then we both migrated to consulting in the early 2000, or actually, early 2000, late 90s. And so our consulting experience comes from, we were with MS Gerber and Associates, that was bought by Global Energy Decisions, that was bought by Ventyx, that was bought by ABB, that is now owned by Hitachi. So so at the ABB, I was the Southeast lead. So I'm very familiar with the Southeast. So that gives some additional expertise in dealing with some of the nuances of the non-traded markets that are occurring within the Southeast. We've also valued assets. We've worked on projects where we're evaluating storage. So evaluating storage from a fundamentals perspective will not be an issue. And Compass actually does a very good job. It's known for being superior to other software technology and being able to evaluate the optimization of batteries on the grid, as well as dependent batteries that are charged by, say, a solar plant, and that battery is dependent upon that. So it will optimize the charge discharge based on energy or load. I did it again. Don't know why it's not letting me advance the other direction. So I think I've pretty much covered what we do, except that I do want to say everything that we do is from a fundamentals perspective. So a lot of, not a lot, but of some of the consulting groups out there, when they're doing a forecast of energy markets, they're looking at, Ed was saying you've got heat rates. So they may look at an implied heat rate, an implied gas price, and come up with, say, an annual view of what the energy prices would be. So we're developing it from a fundamentals perspective, which is looking at the supply and demand curves and where those intersect and what the resulting energy price would be given different assumptions on fuel prices, as well as different assumptions on what that supply would be. So we develop 9 scenarios semi-annually with our advisory outlook, and plan to use those 9 scenarios in evaluating the integrated resource plan for Lake Worth. This gives us the ability to be able to stress test the selection of resources so that you can take into account those uncertainties associated with natural gas prices or carbon prices, or if everybody says we're going net zero, there's no new gas facilities being built. So everybody wants to go 100% solar. What's the impact on the energy markets and the impact on the portfolio selection for Lake Worth Beach? Back up here. So what is integrated resource planning? Like I just mentioned, it's a process where you're looking at supply and demand side options, and you're looking for consistency in that plan. So you're looking at those plans being implemented and evaluated against the energy market, so that one, you're balancing your system from a capacity perspective as well as an energy perspective. And so the Encompass model will make sure that there's energy there for all hours as well as capacity. So that's our plan, is to then develop a plan that meets your goals of low cost, reliable service, and attain your low carbon goals. I think initially we're targeting a zero carbon emissions by the 2050 timeframe, and tempering that down based on discussions with Ed. But of course, we're looking to the advisory board to provide any additional feedback or input, and we can conduct sensitivities to any of these assumptions that we make to ensure that we've got all the bases covered by the end of this process. As I said a couple of times, we're using the Encompass model. It's a mixed integer linear programming algorithm, and it does do it from a fundamental perspective to minimize cost. And it actually has the ability to solve for minimizing your carbon footprint so that it will take that into account. From what we've been seeing with some of our other work, there are trade-offs in meeting that carbon footprint where it may not produce the least cost plan, but that's an evaluation that we'll explore once we get into looking at some results from this to see what the trade-offs are for that least cost plan versus carbon targets. So from a fundamentals perspective, we start with the hourly demand. So hourly demand is going to be consistent with what you're calling energy. So Lake Worth Beach has provided us with your hourly demand through 2025. And so we rolled that up to monthly and annual peaks in energy. So when I say peak, that is the maximum demand in any given month or year. So what you see on the right-hand side is just some of the sensitivities that we've done in our advisory outlook. So in the high demand, we're exploring electrification. And in the lowest demand that you see here with the green line is where we're also exploring increased levels of energy efficiency, as well as higher levels of demand response, applying downward pressure. The yellow line is going to be just some downward pressure due to GDP changes. So it's not really going to stress test energy efficiency and demand response, but it stress tests the economy and the downswings based on that. And as I mentioned, electrification. This graphic just gives you an idea of what the electric vehicle outlook is for, looks like within Florida. So as you can see in West Palm, that's one of the higher levels of penetration across from within the state. So there will be assumptions made to the amount of electric vehicle electrification. I don't think heating electrification is going to be that big of an issue for Florida. And from a demand side perspective, we can and will explore demand response, energy efficiency, as well as behind the meter resources. So you can see that since 2017, behind the meter generation has increased at Lake Worth more than double what the other municipalities have seen. So there are assumptions that we can make regarding that, or we could make it such that it's added based upon economics, but usually that's just an exogenous input because you're not going to necessarily be offering incentives to your customers to do that behind the meter generation because that's an additional cost to the city. But there could be incentives for, doing just community solar programs that you don't have to incentivize, but the solar installers may incentivize. And what you see to the left is the energy savings from different electric efficiency programs. So you can see how wide these bars are. So that represents the amount of savings that you're getting. So, whenever we talk about energy efficiency, at least in the circles I run around in, is that we talk about the low-hanging fruit. So this is your low-hanging fruit where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck through these large blocks, and it's also at the lower cost. So when you start looking at some of the other energy efficiency measures that could be taken, you can see that there's not as much benefit and there is a higher cost. So we can explore some of those energy efficiencies as the stakeholders desire.
Can I interrupt real quick? Excuse me, this is Ryan Outlander. I have in the backup materials, the right side graph is different in terms of the total IOU, total municipal, and the Lake Worth Utilities percentages. This is what's on the public as well. Do you know what the changes would have been from your copy from the one that's made to the public?
Yes, so initially when I did that graphic, I was looking at the total generation versus just the net metered piece that you get the benefit of. So that was the main difference there, is just switching from one column in the report to another column in the report. Does that answer your question?
Oh, no, thank you.
That was just a correction where I was pointing to the wrong column initially. So these are your existing supply side options where we've got the Tom G. Smith, and as Ed indicated, Stanton will be retiring in 2025. You've got your ownership piece of St. Lucie. You've also got the solar, in-city solar, as well as the solar PPAs with FNPA. Some of the options that we're going to explore, and this is by no means 100% complete as far as the types of options that we will explore. But of course, we will explore solar and batteries, and possibly, adding combustion turbines that could meet that peak. But then if you have that goal of net zero, then you'd have to have something to offset it. So that's still an option to explore, but that's something you want to keep in the back of your mind, as well as any other purchase power agreements and any other technologies. I mean, I know that Lake Worth is not going to develop a small modular reactor just for the city, but it's possible that NextEra or someone within Florida could do that and sell you a portion of that. So that could be a PPA from even a nuclear plant that doesn't exist yet.
So Kathy, this is at liberty. Let me jump in here and make a couple of comments about combustion turbines, because not everybody may appreciate why we still need combustion turbines. So it's possible that even as we add more and more solar, when you get to that cloudy day, when that unit doesn't run, or you have inverter problems, it's down for maintenance, you need power from somewhere, right? We need power from someplace. And so at that point, unless you have a resource, a combustion turbine, either because you own it or because you've contracted with it for capacity purposes, which would then give you some energy by fueling it, you wouldn't otherwise have a way to get power. So you'd wind up short or deficient in the market, which means you'd pay some extraordinary prices for power, even if you could get it, right? If we look at what happened in Texas, for example, as an extreme case, which I believe will likely happen in multiple parts of the country over the coming years, if not this summer. When those resources dry up, you have to get the power from someplace. So hope is not a strategy. You actually have to have something firm under contract. So that's why you still need some combustion turbines in here to back it up. You may not run them often, but you still need them as a backup, which was partly why we were going to keep our existing combustion turbines that are at the T.G. Smith power plant. Even though we may retire steam assets there, we're going to keep the combustion turbines because they do have tremendous value for us in avoiding having to go out and buy more or buy more contracts. So they have some value to them.
Exactly. And they also will be sitting there to help you meet not necessarily your energy demands, but it'll be there to help you meet your capacity demands, such that it's there that you could call on in emergency situations.
Right. And I think, well, as we'll talk about more when we get into batteries. So the knee-jerk reaction is typically say, oh, yes, but we'll have batteries. And I say, okay, so how do you recharge the battery? So if you were to have a period of time, 2, 3, or 4 days, and now you've exhausted the battery, how do you recharge the battery if you don't have sunshine for multiple days in a row, right? So that's why we still need to have combustion turbine capability in background. Because typical batteries are going to be a 4, a 6, or an 8-hour discharge. And how do you recharge them? Food for thought.
Thank you, Ed. So, Greg, are you back? Okay, this is his favorite slide, and he does so much better on it than I do because he likes the software, and I'm just like, okay, yeah, it's software. So I will do my best to make him proud. So the Encompass planning model is an all-inclusive. So you see this entire bubble, so that it is optimizing and co-optimizing based on all of these factors. So one, it's going to optimize the capital projects. And so that's going to optimize based on lease cost and or environmental constraints. But at the same time, it's looking at the reserve margin requirements through the demand curves and solving for any environmental programs such as a CO2 limit. So then in addition to that, it's going to do the full unit commitment where it's going to dispatch your system. And in the case where we're doing development of energy prices, it's dispatching every plant in North America and optimizing to find what's the best match to fit that energy need. It also does ancillary services, but there's really no need, I guess, in the exercise with Lake Worth Beach to address ancillary services because I don't think you've got a requirement. And then it also.
Yeah, let me comment on that because most folks on the phone may not be available or aware of what these ancillary services are. So the ancillary services are services other than just pure energy. So if we look at things like spinning reserve, so spinning reserve, and these by the way, these ancillary services are really provided for us by the local transmission provider, which is Florida Power and Light. So these costs are buried within our FPL bill, and we do expect that these will grow over time. They'll at least begin to segment them out further, and then we expect it to increase. So spinning reserve means that there's always a power plant spinning to pick up the load. So for example, if you had 10 units in your system as a transmission operator, and the biggest unit is, let's say, 200 megawatts, that means that the remaining 9 units, the other 9 units, have to be able to pick up the loss of that 200 megawatt unit within a few minutes. Typically, it's 15 to 30 minutes, I believe. That's spinning reserve. And those are requirements that are imposed by the federal government, specifically FERC, to maintain stability of the grid. So spinning reserve is a service that's provided typically in this area by the transmission operator, but is also provided to some extent by the Florida Municipal Power Pool, and is a cost to us. Regulation up and down, that's voltage regulation locally, that's also done. And then of course, bidding for power to fill those gaps. These are all really, really complicated electric components. They don't necessarily drive the resource plan overall, but they're important at the edges. Is that fair to say, Kathy?
Exactly. The only thing to add to that is that in other markets, such as like PJ and some of your organized markets like PJM and MISO, ancillary services ends up being a component of what's driving the build out for the batteries. So batteries are better able to serve that reg up and reg down. So that's when those ancillary revenues really come into play for the batteries, such as like ERCOT that you just mentioned. So like ERCOT prices get really, really high from an energy perspective. And so as their system gets tighter and tighter, so does this spinning reserve and the reg up and down. And that's where the batteries then kick in and serve ancillary services because they've already got all of their other capacity serving energy needs. So then the batteries kick in. Because ERCOT, for example, you were talking about how for planning purposes, you can't count on 100% of the solar. So ERCOT is unique in that it says we're not going to count on the battery capacity in determining what our supply is. It's only there strictly for ancillary. So it's not even working in the energy market.
I think it's probably important for the audience to know that there are some very significant structural differences in the markets between Florida And you've heard us talk about ERCOT, which is Texas, PJM, which is the majority of the Northeast, MISO, which is in the Midwest Independent System Operator. Those states, those regions tend to be deregulated energy markets, meaning that the utilities are not the sole providers or the builders of power generation resources. In those states, the majority of the utilities have migrated to a delivery mechanism only. So think of this as the public's supermarket. So in Florida, if we were the supermarket, we would be required to make sure that there's always oranges there. In those other states, the supermarket's only required to make sure that the doors are open. Whether there's product in those shelves or not is the responsibility of the free market in those other states. The philosophy being that the free market and profits to be made from making power or providing these ancillary services will cause investors to show up and build something. That is not the case in Florida. Florida is not a deregulated market. It is a very tightly regulated and controlled market where the utilities are vertically integrated, where they have the responsibility for making sure that there's always sufficient power in that wire in the form of capacity and energy, and that the transmission system is working properly, and that the delivery system is working properly as metered. So they're vertically integrated by law. In those other locations in the country, that is not the case. So you can't always say that, hey, what happens to work in Illinois or New Jersey or Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, or Indiana should work here in Florida. That's not necessarily the case because of the basic structural differences in how those markets are managed.
That's a very good analogy, Ed. Greg, I see you're back. Is there anything else you want to add to this slide? Well, I thought he was. I saw him on the participants list.
Suhey may need to upgrade him to a panelist to be left and came back in. He may have to be changed to a panelist in order to speak. But
so this is just a larger map of the 78 market area. Ooh, now I'm getting feedback. And this just further splits up the Southeast between the different market areas. So we generate prices at each one of these bubbles in the Southeast. Okay. For our spring 2022 forecast, this gives you an annual view of the natural gas prices, and this is just Henry Hub. This doesn't represent what the delivered gas price would be to the Florida area or the Florida zone. But what you can see is how the prices are backwardating based on the current markets and then start to rebound. We produced this forecast and locked these prices in as of March 30. And if you follow the gas market, which I think based on Ed's comments, he is, this may be more indicative of what we're actually experiencing now. As far as this high $10 price. So we also, like I said, we do the high natural gas, which represents the 90th percentile, and we do the low natural gas, which represents the 10th percentile. And then we have a different natural gas price for our CO2 tax scenario, which is based on EIA in 2021 did a national carbon tax scenario. And so we look at what they had in the way of change in natural gas prices and reflect that against our natural gas prices.
And we'll be providing them with proxies for the differential or basis differential between gas at the Henry Hub and gas in the Florida market zone.
Right. And we actually have that already.
Okay.
But it would be great to get confirmation that our numbers are in line with what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you get it from Platts?
No, we get it from Natural Gas Intelligence.
Okay, probably very similar.
Yeah, I mean, when we first started getting it from Natural Gas Intelligence, we had a client who got plants, and we did like a quick comparison to see if they were close, and they were very, very close. So that gave us some confidence. As Ed mentioned, we're going to be exploring the different different technologies. So in that, we look at what the dollar per kW installation cost or capital cost are for the different technologies. So due to the supply constraints and everything else that's been going on with the batteries and the solar and the wind, we actually increased the price trajectory such that I think year over year, this is like 5% increase based on 2021 before we applied a learning curve. And this learning curve is just technology improvements that are expected to be made in that technology. For the traditional resources of combined cycle combustion turbines and internal combustion turbines, we're just inflating those at the rate of inflation, and our inflation rate is 2.2% exclusive of, a long-term inflation rate is 2.2% exclusive of what we're experiencing now. This gives you an idea of, Ed mentioned you've got your PPAs. I don't recall if he mentioned what the pricing was on these, but overall, from a national perspective, this gives you an idea that in the first quarter of 2022, solar from a national perspective was slightly around $36 a megawatt hour. And then you can see for these traded markets, right, where PJM prices, which is going to be the closest in proximity to the Southeast, is actually experiencing the highest solar prices. So these are all solar. So, but you've got the Midwest that's coming in still at below the $40. But ERCOT and California have historically always had the lower PPA pricing, particularly on solar, and ERCOT is actually probably one of the lowest on wind, but I don't think wind's an option in Florida.
No, let me point out, let's go back 1 second, that slide. When you for the audience, when you look at these numbers, these are for what are called utility scale projects. In Florida, those are typically 75 megawatts or 74.5 megawatts in size. In other parts of the country, they may be in the hundreds of megawatts. I can tell you that all of the solar that we've contracted for, it is under $40 a megawatt hour. And I've probably disclosed numbers that are publicly available in the past. Always very careful not to disclose the actual number because they're protected trade secret by the supplier. But suffice it to say that the numbers that you see in this curve are representative of what we've seen in our contracts.
Yeah, and the other thing too to mention is that you got your contract back in 2018, and the trend, as you can see across all of these markets, and even from a national perspective, is as of 21, when the supply constraints all started hitting, and they did the tariffs on the solar panels, everything just went up. The expectation is, though, at least from everything I've read, is that this will eventually come down, but it's probably not going to be until maybe 24, 25 before these start to trend downward again. So I've mentioned our 9 scenarios. So we have the base, which is generally status quo. And I mentioned the high natural gas and the low natural gas. We also do the high demand, which I mentioned that's based, on electrification. Low demand is just economic downturn. But we put another spin on high and low natural gas by instituting a carbon limit and letting the Encompass model solve for what a carbon price would be to be able to meet that limit. And that limit is an 80% reduction from 2005 levels, consistent with the Paris Climate Accord. And then we also do a national carbon tax, which is consistent with EIA 2021, that starts out at $15 a short ton, increasing at 5% above inflation through time, but we tempered that down so that it would only increase at 2.5% above inflation after 2030. And then there's a zero carbon additions, which I think is probably one of our more interesting ones, where we say everybody does clean energy. Nobody installs any more new gas resources in North America. So everybody's building solar, wind, and batteries.
So what Kathy is introduced here for us and is an important concept, which we'll be talking about in the coming slides, is the percent carbon reduction. So the path that we've been on is tied to the 2005 levels. And what we've said is we wanted to get at a 50% reduction by 2025. So in the absence of any other goal, that's the goal that we set and we've been driving to. What we need to do now, and we've given Kathy and Greg some guidance on the straw man, if you will, for the start of the discussion. But key thing for you all to think about is going to be, what percent reduction do you want to have by, let's say, 2035 or 2050? And I would suggest that you set two targets so that we go onto a path and not defer all the gains till the end, right? So that's going to be an important part of the discussion that's coming up, is what carbon reduction strategy should we align around, and tie that to dates, because that will then drive the types of projects that we look to buy power from in the future.
Exactly. And I should also add that all of these scenarios have a carbon limit on them. It's just that we are only allowing the Encompass model to solve for a carbon price in these two. So all of the other scenarios have a carbon limit on it of 60% reduction from 2019 levels. And it was targeting also to a 30% reduction by 2035, consistent with what Biden was proposing to do. So all of these have carbon reduction targets in them. It's just that it's not producing a price. Because that carbon price, when it starts entering into the energy price, as you'll see in a few more slides, you'll see that, you add $20 in carbon into the regular energy market on top of that natural gas, and you're going to see some uplift in the energy prices. Somebody's got to pay that tax. This is basically just a matrix that's showing you the movement directionally of the assumptions. So what you see in this first block are the market drivers. So the arrows directionally tell you that, the reference load is the same across these three scenarios. Hello? Oh, okay. And you have your high demand, and then you have the extremely low demand, and then slightly lower demand. Same thing directionally with natural gas prices. And even though, natural gas prices, we have coal prices changing in conjunction with the natural gas prices, because you can't just change one, it's going to influence both. One of the other big drivers in the development of the energy prices are the assumptions that you make in the technologies as far as additions and retirements. So this gives you an idea of what the assumptions are across the different scenarios. And I should say economic retirements is something that the Encompass power planning model does, where we say, okay, you can retire this unit as early as 2030, even though its retirement date or age-based life is 2050. So the model will look at the economics of those resources and determine whether it's viable for it to stay online. And so that's where these economic retirements come into play in these scenarios, because that's going to be a major driver, because something has to replace something that was out of the money. So then the model is going to expand the additions given whether you can do natural gas or wind or solar based on economics. So it completely changes the landscape of the energy markets and the resource mix through time. And it does it based on economics.
So let's talk about why that's important, because we talked about retiring steam assets, which we intend to do because they're very, very expensive to maintain, and they're also well beyond end of life, and the cost to extend their life would be prohibitive. At the same time, we talked about keeping our combustion turbines, what we call GT1 and GT2. Recognize that we say that those are relatively cheap units to maintain. That's only until they break, right? One is 1968 vintage, the other is 1975 to 78 vintage. And I often say to folks, do you remember what car your parents were driving in the late 1960s or 1970s to go to work every day? Most people don't remember, or were not around in those times. And we say, well, we're still driving that car, relying on it every day. So we have to think about how much longer will we have those turbines, because the let's say the pent up maintenance that is waiting to happen there when there's a failure will effectively cause the retirement of those units, and then we'll be scrambling to replace that capacity in the marketplace. So we have to plan for that in advance and not just wait until it happens, because we are way beyond the economic life, and certainly way beyond the book life from an accounting point of view, and way beyond when people would normally rely on such devices. But that's what we're hanging on here in Lake Worth Beach.
Right. And so we can make that an option where the model will look at the economics of those resources and say, yeah, we're gonna take it out, and it will replace it with the most economic option. What you see in this second block, and I'm not going to go into that much detail, is this gives you some idea of what was built to replace all these age-based and economic retirements. So you can see that, and the arrows here aren't necessarily always indicative, because I just saw the storage where it says it's went down, but it's actually 16%. So you can see that with high natural gas prices, you're going to have more solar, more wind, less gas-fired resources. But then with low natural gas prices, you're going to see less solar, less wind, and more competitive natural gas additions. So they change through time. And as I said before, with zero carbon, the blend that you're going to see for your zero carbon emitting resources is it's going to be more solar, not as much wind, but you see 25% of that resource mix is batteries. We also do the exogenous input for the behind the meter or distributed generation. So with high demand, we would assume that you're going to have higher levels of distributed generation, because internally, me as a customer, I'm going to try to offset that high demand by putting a solar panel on my house, versus with low demand, I'm just going to let it ride and let the utilities serve my needs. The other expansion option that's available within Encompass is it can actually add transmission. We did not do any transmission economic expansion except in the zero carbon, and that was actually necessary. So think about a future where there's no more gas-fired facilities being built, and you're putting in all this wind and solar in non-load center areas. You've got to have something to get it to the load center. So that's where the economic expansion of transmission plays a key role in that scenario.
So
that's not going to be an issue, really, I don't think, for Lake Worth Beach.
That's correct. So today, the single tie line has capacity well in excess of our needs for the foreseeable, 10 to 20 years. However, it's a single tie line. By adding the second tie line, we greatly increased our import capability, which was not a must-have, but it solved our reliability concern. So we'll have more than enough import capacity. So we're not going to need any more transmission investment. However, the grid itself under FPL and OUC and Duke they will be making rather significant transmission investments to facilitate all of these distributed solar resources, which are being built all over the state. That's already beginning, and that's going to be showing up in our transmission charges for all electric customers in the state will bear those costs.
And this also has an influence over what the energy prices are as well, because you can't build all this stuff and have it just sit there and get congested. It just raises the prices. So when you've got the transmission to get it out, it actually lowers prices. So the sensitivity there for Lake Worth Beach is going to be evaluating against those lower energy prices and how your portfolio would perform and expand. This just gives you an idea specifically for Florida, what the resource mix changes are. So you can see 2021, you've got a lot of combined cycle. There is coal there. You just can't really see it. But so by 2050, and that's all these bars that you see to the right, coal is pretty much non-existent within the Florida region. So you're seeing behind the meter, and you can see in the zero carbon additions how that behind the meter really starts to influence the levels of combined cycles, as well as you can see then this dark blue is the level of photovoltaics, and then the penetration of batteries when you introduce carbon and low natural gas. So this gives you an idea of how those different resource mixes actually play out specifically for Florida. Then this gives you just a general idea of the all hours price in Florida across the different scenarios. So you'll remember I mentioned about how the carbon price will influence the energy price. So CO2, low natural gas, is staying right down there with low natural gas prices. But to be able to meet that carbon limit, it introduces a carbon price. And you can see how that carbon price just causes prices to spike up to over $100 a megawatt hour. The same thing where you've got the base case, that spike you see there is consistent with where we're seeing the Henry Hub prices spike. But the rest of them, you know, and then you've got the zero carbon additions where I said, okay, you're going to start introducing transmission and it's going to have a negative impact on energy prices, or positive, which depending upon which side of the equation you're looking at it from. So you can see how those prices start to then trend downward, consistent with low natural gas prices. So these are the energy prices we'll be using against for assessing your integrated resource plans.
Kathy, does your model take into account the growing amounts of gas leaving the country as liquids?
The growing amount of what?
Of LNG that's exiting the country. So the pressure on gas prices in the U.S. to kind of track more of the European and the Chinese and Indian markets for LNG.
Well, because we rely on NGI or natural gas intelligence for our natural gas prices. The model doesn't really have that feedback loop in it to solve for a natural gas price based on the amount of demand from the power sector. So that's really something that we kind of bake into our high natural gas price assumptions. So what we're seeing now with the LNG issues, that's resulting in that spike you're seeing here. But everything that we've read is that that's not going to be long lived. But okay. You never know.
Right. Okay.
So then, the carbon footprint. So this is specifically for the state of Florida of the emission levels for carbon. And you can see that zero carbon, even though there's no coal, you saw how we had depleted the level of natural gas, you still have some carbon emissions in that case where all you're building is renewables and batteries. But the key takeaway too, though, is with this high natural gas, you're introducing a carbon price. And so it's trekking along, but then it really starts to have an impact. So that carbon price drove it down considerably in the out years. But the reference and all the others are pretty much hanging together here. The other thing to take away from this is, remember I said you've got high demand. So you would expect with high demand that you're going to have much higher levels of you're going to have much higher levels of CO2 emissions just because you've got to burn something to meet that demand. But because we had a carbon limit in there, the model made sure that it increased the retirements to meet those lower levels of the carbon emissions. So you don't see a spike because of high demand, but it does influence the resource mix. Okay. So Greg, are you back yet? He's just abandoned me. Okay. So
No,
in
I'm
28.
here. Sorry. Yes, I'm on my cell phone to make this happen.
Do you want
So-
me to keep speaking then?
Yes, I think you're doing a fine job, and just to keep it simple. Thanks.
Okay. So in 2018, this was our planning effort. One was transmission upgrades, and this was before you had the new ties coming in. It was to repower and or retire your existing resources, extend or cancel the power contracts, develop in-city solar storage, renewable, and offshore wind. It also included the ocean current, which isn't listed here as a resource decision. And then we evaluated it under these given uncertainties that are going to be very similar to what we're looking at. One key takeaway to look at this is keep in mind the uncertainties and the resource decisions when we move to the 22 planning effort. So
let's go back to the 2018 for a second, because I want to speak to the resource decisions and let the public know what we did on each one of those. So with regards to transmission upgrades, we made the decision to go ahead and get a second transmission tie line into the city. And we successfully negotiated an agreement with FPL to do that. And that is currently under construction with a targeting service date of December of 2023. In terms of repowering or retiring existing resources, the decision was made to not repower, but to instead retire steam assets to coincide with the commercial operation date of the transmission upgrades, because those steam assets are costing us a lot of money to maintain. In terms of power contracts, we did sunset the power contract that we had for supplemental. We sunsetted that at the end of 2018. In the fall of 2018, we issued a competitive solicitation, and that was won by OUC, who happened to have the first contract that we were replacing, but the contract that we awarded them, which was sourced competitively, was much better than the first contract that we had with them. And that led to savings of about $9 million a year. Develop in-city generation. So develop in-city generation was something that we knew probably wasn't going to make any sense at all, but we had to evaluate it just to show how little sense it made relative to what we could do in the market. So the ability to buy power in the market at very competitive prices was so much the case, and so much so that it was deemed to not be viable to really spend money on building a power plant in the city. It would have also consumed our borrowing capacity, if you will. We felt that our borrowing capacity was better utilized on renewing our distribution infrastructure through our system hardening and reliability improvement program. The logic there being that generation is a commodity, and you can pick which flavor you want, and you can buy it as a commodity, but you can't commoditize our distribution system, our transmission system, and our relationship with our customer. So we decided to invest in rebuilding distribution system as opposed to using that borrowing capacity to build a power plant, which would produce power that was more expensive than we could buy in the market. if that makes sense. Solar storage and other renewables. We investigated storage. We couldn't find anything that was attractive, but we did go big on solar and went with 36.55 megawatts of solar contracts coming out of that resource decision. Offshore wind, we did not explore, but the ocean current energy is still out there really as a dream, but it is not viable at the moment. We couldn't do any planning around it. And that's probably still the case. I think the best hope there is that an underwater test lab gets built for developing those technologies off our shore. But there'd be no project you could commit to today to produce power by a certain date. There'd be nobody to give you that contract. So that's what we did with the 2018 resource plan.
Thank you, Ed. So our effort in 2022 is going to also then incorporate demand side management as well as the environmental footprint as far as a decision. So there was really no thoughts in 2018 of, trying to meet some carbon reduction targets. So the environmental stewardship will be a decision within this process, as well as the distributed generation. But the uncertainties are also going to be around the level of CO2 emissions, load growth, and other. And this is by no means meant to be all-inclusive. We will explore resource decisions that we find for particularly demand-side management and from load growth, of exploring energy efficiencies and the potential there, as well as distributed generation. Because if you think about it, those are going to be distributed generation is going to be low cost to no cost. Energy efficiency could be low cost to no cost, as well as now demand side management. But we're going to explore all possibilities, and we're going to look at them against all of these different uncertainties. And all this is just going to drive to developing a robust resource strategy. Because like one of the things that came out of our 2018 effort was we left with Ed some net present value cost that was a break-even assessment. So he was able to go back to that information through time and say, okay, when we did this analysis, it said, if I can get a PPA for anything below this level, it's going to be a least cost option across these different scenarios. The same thing with like some of the other combustion turbines that if you had wanted to explore replacement resources there. So we left that in hand. So that's going to be part of developing the robust resource strategy, so that it's not just we do this planning effort, we walk away. He's got a document in hand and information in hand that can guide the strategy going forward. So our process that we go through with practically any integrated resource plan is we start with gathering the data. So we've been working with Lake Worth Beach to gather the data for your demand and resources and contracts. We have information that we maintain internally with Horizons Energy, as you saw in that capital cost, about what the available options are and the cost associated with them. So then we go through a validation process, and we'll do that with Ed and Brian to validate the demand, the resource, the contracts, and then to also validate the cost associated with the different options. As I mentioned, we developed the metrics for the net present value on these project plans. But in addition to that, there will be a metric for this 2022, depending upon the feedback we get from the advisory board and from Ed on what you want to see as far as the CO2 metrics. And then we analyze all of these options against the different markets that we saw those energy prices for. And then we assess the sensitivity. So for instance, if the optimal plan comes out and says, oh, build this combustion turbine, this much solar, this much PPA, then we start doing sensitivities that says, well, okay, what if we don't build this combustion turbine? What's the impact on the net present value, or what's the impact on the cost, so that we can identify for Lake Worth Beach what the potential is, either from an upside or a downside on each one of these different resource selections. So we have a timeline, which we call this a timeline, but this basically tells you about the steps we're going to go through before we get to the end. So we had the introductory meeting on June 28th. We are still in the process of data validation and developing the demand response alternatives and the results validation. But that this piece, we met with Ed, but not last week, week before. So we're getting very close there. Then we'll be able to start working on doing some preliminary runs and looking at the results. And then internally within Horizons, we validate the results before we actually present any preliminary results to Lake Worth Beach. And then we get your feedback and any changes or assessments or sensitivities to produce the final results, and then make a presentation to the advisory board and the commission, I suppose, Ed.
Yeah, I think what's going to be very important for us to get from the advisory board is the level of CO2 reductions that they'd like to see our community achieve. Because I would suggest that we're not necessarily in love with one particular technology over another. What we're trying to do is achieve the environmental benefit, right? So at the moment, I don't see any other way to do that other than, practical way to do that other than solar plus batteries. So I think we really need to get some guidance on what levels of CO2 reductions we'd like to have by specific dates, so that we can drive the model. Right now, you've used some numbers which I gave you really as a straw man for a starting point of the modeling, but by no means should that bind the community. The community should hear what those numbers are and input what they think they would like to see. So I think that's probably something that we want to have as a homework assignment for everybody, is to be thinking about what kind of CO2 reductions they want to have. So it might be helpful for you to review which ones we used as a starting point for the modeling.
I don't remember them off the top of my head. I do remember that it was zero. Let's see.
Was it 0 by 2050 and 75% by 2035? And this was all measured against the 2005 emissions levels.
Right. So it was 50% by 2025, 75% by 35, and then 100 by 50.
Right. Perfect. So again, for the advisory board and for the commissioner's benefit, that's as per Ed, right, as a way to start the discussion. But you don't feel that you need to be bound by that. So if you feel that it ought to be higher or lower or move the years around, it doesn't have to be tonight, but start thinking about what you would like those numbers to be, because that's going to drive the types of resources that the model then leads you to.
Ed, I'd like to add on to that too. Cost is an important factor because, as most of you know, electric is not the only utility in the city here, and it could negate our efforts if we drive too much of a cost to the end user, and by doing that they switch to natural gas appliances, because natural gas is a utility in the area. So I just want that to be a thought in everybody's head, is that these numbers would probably be just for the electric utility driving down carbon reductions, not community carbon reductions. Correct?
Correct. It would be the electric utilities carbon.
I have a question, Ed. Sorry, this is Ryan Aldlander. I'm not sure how far the technology has come, but in terms of reducing carbon footprint, is flexible nuclear plants, are they a viable product yet, or are they still a long ways out?
I think they've become more viable in the last few weeks with I think an endorsement of the small modular reactor design, but I don't view that as something that we would be able to put into our IRP at this point. You know, maybe the next IRP or the 1, 3, or 4 cycles from now, but I think it'd be a long ways away from being able to factor that into our portfolio. Certainly not from the standpoint of building something in the city. I can imagine, you know, the opposition we'd have to something like that. But that doesn't mean that we won't see it in Florida. I do believe that whether it's Florida Power Light or Duke or TECO, the big producers in the state, that one of them will endorse something like that within the next 2 to 5 years. That's my gut. I don't have any inside information, but when you look at where energy is going and the need to go carbon free, and the realization that you can't possibly build enough solar to displace all the fossil fuel, somebody's going to have to step up and build another nuclear unit.
Well, and just so you, just to point it out, and I didn't point it out when I gave this, is that the zero carbon additions, nuclear was an option there, and we're using the small modular reactor. Granted, it's not the micro reactor, it's not a 30 megawatt, it was a 600 megawatt reactor. So you can see, if you look at this compared to US CO2 tax, it did build a nuclear unit in Florida.
Okay.
And that was based on economics. They did not become economic until the mid to late 40s.
Do we have breakdowns on how the power is being used from the utility? I mean, if I had to venture to guess, you know, cooling is probably, or HVAC is probably a large portion of our overall energy consumption. Do we look at all like a district cooling, like a chilled water for places downtown that could go, you know, district cooling versus, you know, each having an AC unit on their building, and we sell them that cold water? Or do we look at anything like that?
I have talked about it because I'm a big proponent of district cooling and chilled water loops. And I'm very familiar with them. But in terms to try to quantify how much of our load in the city is cooling related, if we look to our wintertime minimum loads, overnight wintertime minimum loads, you're looking in the range of 25 to 35 megawatts. And then it picks up after that. So I wouldn't be surprised if 50+% of our electric demand is related to cooling load. But we don't have a way to really know that. While we have AMI on every meter, every meter is an AMI meter. It doesn't tell us what actual device is operating in the home.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if we had a guesstimate or something like that where we can kind of extrapolate that. Rough on that.
Our prospective demand response program would help us with this, though, wouldn't it? Because we'd have the data from the smart thermostats.
No, it wouldn't. But I suspect that our cooling load is rather significant because we don't have a base industrial load. So I mean that we don't have hospitals, we don't have manufacturing, we don't have things that are running around the clock, other than, you know, folks air conditioning and some maybe the, you know, elements of the water plant, which is not a big percentage of the city's load. But you know, I think our cooling load is rather substantial. Now, in a chilled water loop, that would only be able to pick up, you know, really the downtown corridor. It would probably be cost prohibitive to build chilled water loop out into residential areas.
Yeah,
because you're obviously plowing up a lot of ground and laying an insulated pipe and building it back to the central plant. We are, as part of a microgrid type of approach, evaluating whether something like that might make sense at, let's say, for example, the Gulfstream Hotel. If we were to use that as an anchor for the start of a chilled water loop, that's That's a very high level analysis. We have not even engaged the hotel in that. We're just trying to, at this point, I'm just trying to determine, is on a macro basis, is it even economically viable?
Yeah.
To create a microgrid that would be based on the thermal load of the hotel. But there's really no other 7x24 cooling load in the city. It's negligible to support a plant. So where we see chilled water loops, for example, in Orlando, OUC is also in the chilled water business, but they've got very large office buildings. They've got hospitals. They got this thing called an airport, right? Which is an international airport, which is probably the biggest, or second largest in the state.
I mean,
So-
even closer, but a smaller scale. I believe the county courthouse is a separate central power chilled water loop, but it's for a few buildings that are all owned by county, not widespread, if I recall correctly. So, I mean, it's not out of the question, but the difference would be someone like the utility running a small, cogen chilled water loop versus it being, the scale obviously helps it, but
Right. Yeah. The
I don't know.
downtown corridor is the most viable. We know that there's also, and it would be a long way to go, but I know that the Palm Beach State College, all the way out on Congress, does have a chilled water plant. But even that plant is virtually shut down on weekends, and overnight they really kind of bottle it up and start it back up in the morning. But so that'd be a long way to go to pick up a load that's intermittent.
I work at Palm Beach State College, and in the summer, we're closed on Friday, so they shut down the AC Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Right. So, and it's a lot of pipe delay to get all the way out there, and not a lot of load to pick up on the way. And also, in my experience, I've dealt with this on college campuses and pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities where chilled water loops are the lifeblood of the facility. It would take an awful lot to convert every customer you have to a chilled water system. So it really lends itself to new construction, because trying to go into something that's operating on an old rooftop DX system and then converting it over to have, heat exchangers and circulating water pumps and air handlers, they're really not set up for that. But it's a good thought for the future. But it would be very hard to do.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So I guess this is mostly to the other members of the board, but are we kind of approaching this IRP as like in-city generation, decommissioning that? Is that the way we want to go? Just because I don't know. That seems, we spoke earlier of hedges and physical hedges against, unforeseen circumstances like natural gas prices shooting up. And there was a lot of optimism in that presentation for prices of things and the direction they'll go in the future. And I would wonder, what about the costs of restoring in-city generation to something modern, what that would look like and why it was cost prohibitive in the past.
Well,
and maybe
Mr.
it looks
Jeffers,
differently now.
Yeah, Mr. Jeffers, would you object to us trying to develop a strategy that just ramped up distributed generation and distributed capacity resources in the community instead? Because, I would just point out that while I agree with you wholeheartedly about the danger of maintaining any further economic exposure to carbon-based fuel generally, but specifically natural gas, as shown by all of our utility bills this month, I happen to think that the site where the plant is located, let alone the environmental justice issues that stand around that site, I mean, both economically and socially speaking, I would love us to be able to, fully decommission that thing and instead replace it with a whole bunch of rooftop solar and batteries. But that's just my idea.
Yeah, and I certainly think that should be part of the plan. It's there's just 4 cloudy days in a row and your batteries run out and there's no sun. But like a backup plan, just the ultimate capacity to have when it's really needed. We don't run that thing often as it is, and I don't know. Like I would just be interested in an analysis of what it would look like to to bring that thing up, you know?
So,
That's brilliant.
so having done this a lot, I've done, to say I've been involved with over $1 billion worth of unit repowerings would probably be honestly an understatement. So I can tell you that the equipment at that plant is not worth saving. It's you can't. It's not like a car show where I'm going to rebuild it and I'm going to run it. And it's going to be better than it was. Even rebuilt, it's not going to be efficient. So
Right.
your most efficient, or your reasonably efficient modern day fossil fuel generating stations are probably going to be in the range of 500 megawatts or more. And we have a peak of 97, right? And we have an average load factor of about 56% on the 97 megawatt peak. Those 500 megawatt plus units tend to have heat rates below 7,000, probably between 5,800 to 6,500 BTU per kilowatt hour.
Mm.
The in-city options that we looked at ranged, I want to say, from 60 to 90 megawatts off the top of my head, and none of them had a heat rate that was better than 9,500 BTUs per kilowatt hour, 9,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour. And they were reciprocating engines running on natural gas that would be located at the power plant. That would be the build it new at our own site. So we looked at that and said, okay, if it's going to cost, $1,000 to $1,200 per kW, I forget the exact number to build, you're going to consume, 90 to 100 plus $1 million of borrowing capacity to build something that is less efficient than what you can buy in the market for energy. And you will have no money left, no borrowing capacity left to rebuild the distribution system, which needs help. So, and then it got into the emissions issue, because I had heard, although I wasn't here at the time, but anecdotally, I understand that previous proposals to build a large scale power plant at that site were rejected by previous commissions. And I don't know, I think that was in the 2010 timeframe, 2008, 9, 10, somewhere in there. I don't have the exact dates, but that's what's been relayed to me. And frankly, I don't see there being a lot of public support for building another fossil fuel power plant where that one exists. Now, having said that, there is a need for peaking in the future. So our strategy so far has been to keep the peaking we have until it just won't peak anymore. We have to anticipate that in a resource plan and say, okay, so if you need peaking capacity to make up for the day when the sun doesn't shine, do you buy that under a power purchase agreement, or do we buy into a plant like we did with FMPA Stanton or FMPA St. Lucie? That's a possibility. Those opportunities are out there in the market. So my advice would probably be, was definitely not to try to build something. I appreciate that this is coming from a guy that grew up in the power generation business and always wanted to work in a power plant, right? And here I am advising you that that's probably not the way to go for this particular municipality because of the size and all these other issues. And the other thing, which we haven't talked about, is the pipeline that brings gas into that power plant site, is a contract that was put in place at about 2003. And that pipe does not have an infinite life. It has only got about a 12 to 13 or 14 year life on the contract, after which we'd have to negotiate yet another contract to move gas down that pipe, and it might need physical improvements. So that has to be taken into account. So I'm not optimistic. Now, in terms of distributed resources around the city, I find it hard to believe that, small reciprocating engines around the city are going to be as efficient as what you can buy on the grid, even when you take into account the delivery cost of getting the power here.
But what happens if you take into account what Kathy said earlier, that they're no to low cost from a capital planning perspective for us?
Well, that would be to the city, right? I mean, because it's going to be the homeowner or business owner who actually incurs the cost for that distributed generation.
Right, fully appreciated, Kathy. But that gets to, what Mr. Portilla was alluding to earlier in terms of grid defection risk and, what we've all experienced over just the last couple of weeks. So, I mean, Director Liberty, my question is, have you seen an uptick in net metering applications, since our latest rate increase or power cost adjustment?
Well, which one? The one that we did on January 1, the one that we did on June 1, or the one that was planned for September 1?
No, the one that the last one you voted on at what would have been the July utility board.
Okay. So I'm going to try hard not to laugh, but so that meeting happened on July 26th. So you're asking me if I've seen an uptick in applications for net metering since the July 26th meeting?
Yeah, or at least an interest. I'm asking. That's exactly what I'm asking. Yeah.
So let me add that I went on vacation July 27th and got back this morning. So I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question. I can tell you that certainly since the beginning of the year, we've seen a significant uptick in applications and customers engaging in solar. As a matter of fact, just early last week or the week before, it was reported to me that one developer had put in 28 applications or 24 applications. Now, some of those may have been for residences that were not even in our territory, but that's just an anecdotal piece I got, and they were looking for information. So there is a significant uptick in requests for customers for net metering, and we'll continue to absorb that as we're required to. But I left on vacation on the 27th and got back this morning, so I don't know what's happened in the last 6 days, 7 days.
And I would add to that if we've seen an uptick since the increases in January and June, which were relatively minor compared to what we just approved at the end of July, I don't think the word has particularly gotten out into the community. It has not shown up on bills, and it won't show up on bills until September 1st. And it'll take people a while to say, geez, my bill seems to be a little higher, and talk to their neighbors. Your bill higher too? And the word sort of, oh yeah, there was a huge increase. It came from fossil fuels. I think there's going to be a bit of a lag before you see those upticks, but I have no doubt that you will see an uptick. And just anecdotally, I've talked to lots of people. People approach me, and the willingness to take on the capital costs to put rooftop solar, people seem very eager to do it, even though it's a significant capital cost. And I think one of the ways to think about that is, well, that's an interesting thing, because that juice is, if any excess they produce, is subsidized to the city. The homeowner is bearing the capital cost on that.
Well, this gets a question I'd actually like to ask for Horizons Energy, which is, Kathy and Greg, have you all done any IRPs in explicitly decoupled markets, right? So have you done any IRPs for utility markets where the regulators have implemented a decoupled rate-making process?
Well, clarified decoupled rate-making process.
All right, well, so that answers my question, but just that transmission and distribution costs, administration costs, everything except for the actual power sales themselves are set through one rate-making process, and then the utility tries to stay secular or agnostic to what's called the throughput incentive. That is the incentive to sell more power as much as possible. In other words, have you worked with any utilities that have explicitly tried to get out of the selling power business?
No, I don't recall that. Not recently.
Okay.
And I
have.
That's
fine.
I have before, but
hold on a
not
second.
in the last couple of years.
Yeah, but hold on a second. That question doesn't make any sense, because if the utility is no longer in the business of making power, it doesn't need a resource plan.
Well, so this gets to why. Well, no, that's
no.
Okay,
I disagree with that.
Yeah. So the obligation is on the generation side. So I think, though, they've pointed out that they've done extensive work in PJM and New Mexico and Midwest ISO and in various other states where you have these, I'm not going to call it decoupled, I'm going to call it deregulated markets, where the utility is not the sole provider of all the kilowatt hours. It's a deregulated market. So
That's quite different, though.
Yeah.
Ed. What Ramsey, I think, is getting at, and it's something that we as a commission in the past have talked about, is ideally, and I think that's what Ramsey probably was referring to with agnostic, that you decouple, you separate the cost of maintaining the T&D system, administration, debt service, all that stuff, from the part of the actual power generation or paying for the fuel or paying for the PPAs, that you set the fuel and power part neutral, so that if you have more customers, you just have to buy more juice. If you have less usage, you buy less, so that it's a wash, so that there's no built-in incentive to sell more.
that's what you have
That
today.
is a pricing model that can be done.
That's what you have today. That's what your PCA does, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so the
it's-
piece, all right. That answers my big question. My next two, and these are my last two questions, are for specific to Horizons Energy. Have any of your IRPs resulted in successful demand response programs or otherwise successful distributed generation, that is distributed markets with successful distributed resource plans?
Yes, I mean, all of the integrated resource plans we've been working on has that component in them. Now, is that the only thing that they build? No, but they have been successful. One of them has been very successful, particularly from a distributed generation perspective, and others I know. And this was a group of municipalities where they put together a program that said, okay, we will incentivize you to install a reciprocating engine at your site. And they were beating out some of the other investor-owned utilities because they offered that service. So then but that was not residential. That was like, more commercial sites. But that incentivized those people to install that reciprocating engine on site, and then they use that to generate the cooling for their water to reduce their demand.
This is Greg. I'll just throw in that I would say most of the time, the demand response clears and becomes part of the resource plan. It is, as Kathy was saying before, it's part of the low-hanging fruit that oftentimes is picked up, especially the real opportunistic programs that are the lowest cost.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the presenter, one of your last slides had the timeline for when you were coming to results and results presentations. Could you tell me about these preliminary results, these final results? What form are these results in? Are they quantitative estimations, or are they procedures or plans?
They are qualitative estimations of what the economics are behind the resource selection or resource optimization.
So you would like compare the different resource alternatives based on these?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So for example, we've talked about demand response, and the way that demand response would work is you would say, okay, Horizons will help us understand what it's going to cost to add capacity down the road, right? The concept of demand response is what if I'm willing to pay X amount of dollars to add a megawatt of resource. It would follow that if I can create a negawatt, meaning I could reduce demand by a megawatt, I would be willing to pay that amount to reduce demand as opposed to paying that amount to increase the supply, right? And you may say I'm more interested in reducing demand because it has an environmental benefit to it as well, right? The value of carbon. So you come up with a dollar value per kilowatt hour or per megawatt rather of installed capacity of demand response that you would like to have in your portfolio. And then you evaluate what demand response programs you can implement at or below that dollar value to achieve that outcome. That's the other part of this discussion, right? But what's important is to go back and set what are the CO2 reductions, what is the path, the glide path that you would like to be on. That's going to be a very important part of this. I think I've suggested at a minimum that we say, let's say 5 megawatts of demand response. I don't know if 5 megawatts is right or not, but I'll throw out, I'll throw the first, stone in the river and say, I don't know, let's start with 5 megawatts. Can we achieve 5 megawatts of demand response, and at what cost? Not opposed to it, but we just have to determine what is that glide path of CO2 reduction that you would like to be on. That's a community decision. So you don't have to have an answer tonight, but are there any thoughts while we're on the phone together as to what
I would say that I would argue that our expired parity resolution, you could extrapolate to just say at a minimum, we need to make sure that we are on the same pace that FP&L is in terms of decarbonization, right? Or I mean, ideally, I'd like to exceed it, personally speaking, but I recognize the economic element here, which is why, I will note here, Director, I'm motivated, and I've been a proponent of us engaging in this IRP process for a long time, and I'm thrilled that we are, and I cannot thank you enough for the fact that we have a stronger grid, we have all the solar we already have, and we're now actually talking about demand side resources. But I think we'd be remiss to, not recognize the economic reality of the community in which we exist, right? That, we are arguably the second or third most impoverished community in Palm Beach County, right? So if there are resource planning decisions we can make that over the long term will keep more money in our community, and I don't just mean by keeping power prices artificially low in the short term. I mean over the long term, ensuring that people in our community have access to stable power prices that stay affordable, over the long term, especially for people on fixed incomes. And if there are ways for us to enter into economic arrangements where, if I as a consumer want to pay a premium, but that premium goes to my neighbor or goes to my city more than it goes to power generators outside of the city, I want to have the option to pay that premium, right? Because yet again, I frankly believe, we all do better when we all do better, right? To, quote a wise senator. And this is an opportunity for us to do that for our neighbors by figuring out how do we just keep as much money in the community through our resource planning.
And I would strongly second that, especially the first part, that we are a community that many people are quite strapped, a number are not. And I think presenting ideas as, hey, would you be willing to do a little extra to help out others in your community do a little better? Yes, I think that there would be a lot of enthusiasm for that. I also think that as we think about demand response, we recognize that it's an elastic context. As people see the increases that came with the last natural gas, fossil fuel gas hike, their willingness to consider demand cutbacks or other things purely from an economic point of view. I want to reduce my bill. Help me, give me every tool available, every resource available to use less, whether it's knowledge, whether it's demand response systems, whether it's renewable-based energy, whether it's community solar. Hey, give me all the options, because there are a lot of people who are hurting and interested in reducing their bills.
Yeah, all good points. This kind of reminds me of my off the wall idea I had when we were contemplating any and every energy conservation strategy, which included that quote unquote lottery idea where people were incentivized out of selfishness to buy extra points on their bills that would go toward possibly getting a free electric bill or free utility bill that month. And all of the extra funds would be used to help pay residents who can't afford the increases in their bills. It seems like less of a crazy idea more and more time goes on, but I don't know about the legalities of anything like that.
So
There's-
just to, my function here is to provide you with data to help shape your thinking. But I just did, you're clicking away in a calculator here. I said, okay, so let's assume for the moment that we did 5 megawatts of demand response, and that costs us somewhere between $5,000 to $6,000 per megawatt month, which is what it would cost us to build some new power plant, right, for 5 megawatts. That translates to roughly $6 million a year of capital that we would need to conceivably need to borrow to go build that. Because the 5 megawatts, and I don't know the numbers for demand response. I'm saying if you were willing to pay the same amount to build a megawatt of demand response versus a megawatt of new supply side, let's assume that it's the same. My suspicion is demand response is going to be cheaper than building a new megawatt. But when I break that down into base rates, I'm looking at about a $10 to $12 per month increase in base rates to a customer to carry that level of investment. Now, I take that'd be per year. So divide that by 12, we're looking at about a little over $1, something like that. But we need to run through the economics just in the manner that I've described, using the correct numbers, by the way, not just rough numbers I'm bagging out of a solar powered calculator here in my office. But we need to go through that and say, is it going to be economic? My suspicion is that demand response will be economic, and that it will make sense to deploy. But it's not going to create 10, 20, 30 megawatts worth of demand response in a system that's only got a 97 megawatt peak, right? But it's a part of the solution. It's not the entire solution. It's a part of it. And then we did see something recently, which was food for thought. We were watching the load midday in the afternoon, and the load dropped about 5 megawatts, I think, over a relatively short period of time. And we concluded that that was light rain or clouds coming in from the west that suddenly just dropped that load. So my thought was, well, if the load can drop that quickly with cloud cover coming in, that to me would be an indication of how much is being driven by cooling.
You mentioned that at the commission meeting, Director, and I thought it was an interesting observation and useful, an empirical one. I think it would be quite possible out of the data we have to kind of back out an estimate, and a reasonably good estimate, about how much of our load is cooling. I also think it would be possible to work up with some effort, what are the energy reductions if people adjust temperatures by a degree, by another degree. And if people have that in real terms and fairly accurate information, and it would have to be scaled to the building. Some buildings won't make any difference. Some buildings will make a lot of difference. I think armed with information and knowledge, nobody cares about how many kilowatt hours they reduce. Nobody has a clue about that. But how many dollars they reduce, particularly at the higher prices now, I think you would find there's quite a bit of interest in various ways of reducing, whether it's demand response or whether it's voluntary behavior things or whether it's home improvement things. I think there's a lot of elasticity in there that we may not be seeing. I also think there's probably data floating around out there that could be helpful outside of our community, as well as some easy studies that we could do inside.
So we're actually in the process of speaking with 2 firms about helping us with the demand response program, which is quantifying it and then helping us select the technology and ultimately helping us project manage an implementation. What I've read and what I'm familiar with is there are multiple levels, multiple types of technology. So in its simplest form, for example, the FPL program is where they take control of up to three devices in the home, and they interrupt them remotely and shut them off completely. The hot water heater, the pool pump, and the air conditioner compressor.
Be very careful with that term of shut them off completely, because people can easily misunderstand it, especially at a commission meeting. What you really mean is you're cutting the power completely for a limited amount of time.
Right, for that specific device. And I understand that. So, and having actually done these before. So you shut off the power remotely, and I've actually had it done in my own home in the Northeast, where I engaged and subscribed to the program as a user. They shut off your device for some period of time. Now, in the FPL system, and I'm not promoting their system, if they shut off your air conditioning, I think they shut it off for up to 3 or 4 hours. It's not that they shut it off for a few minutes. They shut it off for up to 3 or 4 hours. I don't know how attractive that would be to people, but there are variations of that. In some programs, they shut it off for 15 minutes and no more than once a day or something like that. At the other end, it's hugely
dependent on how it's presented. If
absolutely.
You say, I'm going to shut off your AC, and you don't say any more, you'll get zero participation. If you say, I'm going to shut off your AC for X amount of time, and your house humidity will change by a couple percent that you'll never notice, and a degree or 2 degrees from this degree to that degree, it'll depend very much on how it's presented. I could present it in a way that I would guarantee zero participation, and I'll bet I could present it in a way still accurately that I'd get much higher participation.
Yeah, there's and you go into the details of the FPL program. Once you get past the sales brochure and you go do the research, you realize just how much they can shut it off. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there are programs that take control of the thermostat and just move the thermostat by 1, 2, or 3 degrees. And I've seen some research that indicated that if you just move the thermostat by 1 or 2 degrees, it's a shrug. People may not even notice it or don't care. But once you get to 3 degrees or more, then they really do care and get upset. So what we need is somebody to guide us through that, because I'm not promoting one versus the other. We need to pick the one that's the most effective. And the one that's the most effective is the one that reduces the demand, but also has sustainability to it, meaning that the customers who sign up for it actually stay on the program for years.
Or that you have flexibility built into the program where you say, hey, we'll give you X amount of rebate if you try it with, and I'm exaggerating, but let's say you try it with a 5-degree one. You get a pretty decent rebate, but you may be uncomfortable. Try it out for a month, see what you think. Oh boy, we tried it, we didn't like it. The first couple degrees, yeah, it wasn't a big deal, but 5 degrees, no, that's too much. Okay, we'll give you a smaller rebate and we'll limit it to a 3-degree rise. And you can get to the rise not just by the thermostat, but you can get to the rise by knowing something from the AMI data of how leaky their house is. We have enough data that you could do a quite fine-tuned program and give people the option to say, yeah, the balance here between the cost savings and the comfort, no, I want to shift it back the other way a little bit, and let them adjust.
Well, I'm not sure that we have enough data, because we're also in discussions about a meter data management system. We have at best 18 months worth of data, and it's not organized in a way that's readily extractable for analysis. But that doesn't mean that we can't do this. There are tools to do this. We just have to build them. So I'm not against demand response. I think it's going to be a very important part of our strategy going forward. But again, I want to make sure that and I think you guys want to make sure too, that you have a program that customers don't sample it and leave. We want a program where people sign up for it, but in droves, right? And then stay on it for a long period of time. So it has to be attractive, and it has to be economic to them, and it has to fit their lifestyles. Because at the same time, one of the reasons you don't want them to drop off the program is, in order to have it work, you're going to be investing significant amounts of dollars in capital to deploy this project, right? You want to make sure that you actually get a bang for your buck, right? Not that you've built something that people didn't subscribe to, or they signed up and after the first summer decided it wasn't for them. Now, so we have to make sure it's attractive to them to stay on it, because we don't want to strand any capital that we put out in the field because they decided to stop using it. And I don't think we'll be able to go back to the customer and say, well, since you stopped using it, now you have to pay us for what we installed. I don't see that as being remotely possible. I think we would have to do that at risk. But you want a program that people will subscribe to. And I agree that if saying we're going to shut you off, we're going to turn off that particular piece of equipment for some limited period of time, unless it's a thermostat driven thing. But now you're deploying, the smart thermostat. And one of the things that the marketplace and the public found in Texas, for example, the customers who signed up for these programs in Texas that involved the thermostat had not read the fine print and realized that the utility or their energy, in their case, it was the energy supplier because it's deregulated state, their energy supplier now had control of the thermostat, and they rebelled against that. They did not like that. So that's an example of where the fine print was not well enough disclosed in the marketing, that we were going to, but that the energy supplier was have control of their thermostat.
And again, completely how you present it. If you, and clearly we are a municipal utility, we are looking not to, skewer people or steal stuff from them or make them uncomfortable for no good reason. It wants to be approached from, how can we as a community save ourselves money and incidentally have some environmental benefits? And so you present it as, this is the range that your degrees are going to move around from what you do now. Not that we're going to take over your thermostat. We would have some constraints on the program. That is all possible to design into it.
Yep. I think.
Are we skipping over distributed batteries and electric vehicles in the context of DR as well? Right? Like, I know people who aren't ever going to turn down their thermostat, but would be more than happy to dispatch capacity from their second electric BMW or their Tesla Powerwall if we were asking them to do it.
Yep.
And also in the future, golf carts are going to be having lithium battery packs that of a significant size that could be fed back in.
Yeah. We did just talk about how Lake Worth's like the third most impoverished, municipality in Palm Beach County. So maybe the BMWs, there's not that many of them, but yeah.
Good point.
Powerwalls.
I want to go back to a statement Director Liberty said where he saw a 5 megawatt decrease from cloud cover. To me, that is much more indicative of poor insulation rather than anything else. Because you and I both know, or all of us know, that if we go outside and there's some cloud cover, it's not like you're getting a chill out there. So what they're really ejecting is radiant heat, and that cloud cover blocked it. If we looked at an overall community energy efficiency, this would be probably one of the elements we're talking about are a part of it, but probably not the most effective part. If we can eliminate 5 megawatts of demand by insulation, then that's a different story. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah.
And
I think that's very true. And Director Liberty has already mentioned in public, which I applaud him for, that attic insulation is quite inexpensive. And I haven't looked at the data in a while, but it's one that a lot of utilities will underwrite as part of their conservation, suggesting that the return on it is fairly decent. The other comment that I would make is we have AMI data. So you could, with some little bit of cleverness, look at that data, know when the AC went on, know when it went off. And if you knew something about, it's a 3-ton unit or 5-ton unit, which you could get pretty easily, you can see by the reheating and how long it took, you've got a de facto empirical measure of how leaky that box is that's being cooled. We could, and then you could focus on the ones that are the leakiest and do something with it.
Commissioner, what would you as a commissioner do with that information though? Because that's no longer the purview of the Electric Utility Advisory Board. That's the commission.
What I would do with that data is that would be how I would choose how to focus both maybe demand response, but more importantly, home improvement aspects.
But that's not a demand response. I mean, we all know that if you have a real tight envelope and good insulation, demand response is easy. I've rented a house in Lake Worth. When you have poor insulation and you have jalousie windows, as soon as that demand response kicks on, you're going to know it. So there is that disparity you want to look at as well. And that's not an answer for the electric utility or the Electric Utility Advisory Board. That's the commission and their standards and how do we get these, ultimately landlords to make those improvements on those houses.
Very valid question. Although I would say that it still would be useful to know it, however way one gets it. I'm just pointing out that empirically, physics-wise, you can get it out of the data that we have. If you know where your leaky one's on, those are places where you would focus as a utility, focus some of your energies on education. Let people know, look, unfortunately, you live in a pretty leaky building. If you crank the thing way down, you're going to be pushing a lot of heat right out the walls or the jalousie windows. So, you got to make a choice there and find ways to make it easier for landlords and give incentives to landlords to do better on them.
Yeah, if I may
and that's just off the top of my head.
I just want to interject real quick and then give Mr. Jeffers the floor.
Thank you.
I brought this up back in February. Mr. Stevens made a presentation based on our research about a conservation program, and there have been certain aspects of it that were acted on, like the demand response and other items. But there were other things too, like a citywide shade tree greening program and taking a look at our building codes and other things that we can do with certain fees, occupational fees and whatnot. And it didn't seem to have a follow-up from the commission that we should be fleshing out any particular items that weren't already acted on. Do you know if there's an item on commissioners, forecast of things to look at if we're going to be given a task to kind of flesh out some of the ones that haven't been looked at yet from that February presentation? And then Mr. Jeffers, you can go ahead while Commissioner McBoy is thinking about it.
Okay. Yeah, I think my question's mostly for Director Liberty and then Kathy from Horizons as well. Kathy, if you could go to page 7 on that presentation, that would be excellent. Right. So this graph, just like doing some napkin math on assuming 5 megawatt hours is what we can actually shave off with demand response for 8 hours a day for 365 days a year. That's 14.6 gigawatt hours. And we're looking at that graph, and the most generous one that shows the line going down, I think, assumes a whole bunch of good things. I think maybe the best reality we could possibly hope for is our yellow line, low demand, where we also do all of the good things. And so in that scope, 14.6 gigawatt hours really just starts to look like mostly a rounding error almost on that graph. And I just want to fully frame this in that in coming up with an IRP, I think there's more to do than just talking about demand response. It's certainly not the full story. So there's still like decisions to be made and other places to put mental effort into caring about as far as where our power comes from. In addition to obviously doing demand response, that is a good thing, but just the size of the dent it makes isn't enough to solve problems long term. And that's it. It's not really a question.
I like the approach of let's do some of these back of the envelope calculations, and maybe that's some of what Director Liberty is also pointing out is before we get too far down a particular path, let's make some estimates of what the possible return are. The only thing that I would add to that is the elasticity, and I think I've talked with Director Liberty once. I remember, and it's probably a decade ago, I believe it was Juneau, Alaska, and I don't remember for sure if it was Juneau, but it was in Alaska. One of the cities got most of their power from hydroelectric, and something happened to the transmission line that was relatively close to the city that knocked it down. Their backup was diesel, which was much more expensive. They communicated with the city, and it happened in the winter. And what wound up happening is that the community lowered its demand so much that the utility got very nervous about people getting too cold and not taking care of themselves. The response was so strong on, hey, we need to do something and do something. To me, and I actually called up the utility at that time to learn a little bit more about it. It suggests to me that information can increase the elasticity in some of these things. If people know what the economic consequence of behavioral changes, there's room. If they don't know, then they're not going to do anything for sure. That's the only thing I would add to that piece. So maybe the 5 megawatts is an underestimate, hard to know. To come back to Mr. Oblender's question of the city commission response to some of the things that we haven't visibly already responded to, of some of the suggestions, that's a good encouragement for us to go as a commission to go back and look at them. I can tell you that we just the other day, 2 days ago, it's only on new development and it's only on the larger ones, but we just approved some tighter environmental, some building code aspects for energy efficiency. I suspect that you will see more of that coming for existing buildings in the future. So yes, and there's very widespread interest in the shade tree aspect. How to get it off the ground is less clear, but there's definitely enthusiasm for it and recognition of the importance for a number of reasons.
So the utility, at that February meeting, we created a tracker for each one of those recommendations and then broke them out by the responsible party and the supporting staff that would be needed to implement those. I can tell you that I'm looking at the list right now, all the ones that we said that were really the responsibility of the utility to go forward on, we did that, even though in discussing this with the city manager, she pointed out, well, we were not giving any specific direction to actually go and do this. However, she was appreciative of the fact that we had taken the initiative, and even though there was no specific vote to say, yeah, go do that, we've actually done that. We've gone down the path of doing these types of things. So just going through that. So there was a recommendation that we reach out to customers with large bills. And we have been doing that. We've also now got the online audit program, and we're working with customers to do that. And as customers, particularly also commercial customers, when we see their electric bills going up and they're approaching that demand threshold, we reach out to them proactively and said, hey, something's going on. Your use is going up. You're approaching that demand threshold. Leveraging AMI data to more proactively contact customers instances of regular use. We're working on that. We're doing that. Doesn't mean we're doing it well, but we are doing it. There was a recommendation we explore engaging a grant writer to focus on environmental clean energy and green building projects. Well, we did that. We hired Grant Management Associates, GMA, with experience in an area in the California market that's working around the country, and they're now under contract to us, looking for grant opportunities for these types of things. There was another one said, recommendation, we issued an RFI for demand response program. We actually got a proposal for demand response program. The dollars looked significant. So we're going to be talking with a second provider, so we can get a better sampling of what these costs might be for somebody to help us develop a demand response program. And then there were a bunch of other things that really fell into the purview of the city commission, such as requiring that all properties that have 4 or more units undergo a free audit. Well, if we provide those audits today for free, and but I think the suggestion was that the commission require that they have to go do the audit. Just scanning down a list. There was a recommendation the city commission require all new single-family construction to include bidirectional electric charging stations. I'm not sure that those are available in the market, but the suggestion was that the city commission require that it be done. There was another recommendation that the city implement a formal program for ongoing investments in our citywide shade canopy. So these were all things that were recommended. Again, I think that the commission dutifully listened, but there was no, specific direction coming out of it. But nonetheless, we've still moved forward with some of these items, as best as we can within the utility. We didn't ignore it.
Much appreciated.
Yep. And then I just wanted to add, Commissioner McVoy, absolutely, in the context of having all of the data from AMI or from any other sources available, identifying the properties that need the most insulation, demand response, what have you, that could probably make more than 5 megawatts of demand response. That is possible, but it does require that level of data and intelligence that you're talking about that I don't know where it would come from, but maybe we can get it.
So I spent about an hour on the phone today with a company talking about meter data management systems, MDM, and MDM is if you will the black box into which the meter reads would go and would then be evaluated to identify these things. So we need to bring in, for example, the square foot under air of every single property into the database together with the utility bill, and then track that over a period of time to identify high use per square foot. And then the age, and also then do a cross section on age of the property. Then we can determine, hey, this is probably an older home that doesn't have insulation, has outdated windows, and would insulation help in that property? So for example, if we could create a megawatt of demand reduction by installing insulation, frankly, that's better than creating a megawatt of new energy production, right? Because that's more of a permanent. So if you're willing to spend X amount of dollars to build a megawatt of new capacity in a power plant, would you be willing to spend some portion of that instead on trying to insulate homes? And I'm using insulation because I happen to think that insulation is probably the quickest, easiest hit. But I also rented a home here in Florida for a while that had jalousied windows and not a lot of attic insulation. And I can tell you, and I think we had a 3-ton unit. When that unit would reach its set point and shut off, literally, it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later on a day like today, it would be starting back up. You could feel the humidity suddenly rising in that unit, right? And we'd have the paddle fans going on the ceiling and everything. So there wasn't a lot of latency there. You felt it right away. So I know insulation is important, and the windows are expensive, but it sure is, effective. But that
the windows are extremely expensive, and they go hand in hand with insulation. The superheated attic, but also the windows. That's where you get a lot of your infrared. It's that a targeting of houses like that, and any sort of way to get people to, upgrade that or whatever needs to happen in order to resolve that is absolutely huge megawatts.
And our thinking has been that anecdotally, I understand about probably 50% of our residential customers are rental units, is a tenant going to invest in attic insulation in their home. Maybe some will. I don't think a lot will, but maybe some will. But a landlord sure as heck should be required to do it. If I own the home, I'm going to say, you know what, Saturday, I'm going to Home Depot or Lowe's and I'm going to get a bunch of insulation, or I'm going to have that company come in and blow it into the attic and put 8 inches of stuff up there because I got to get rid of that heat. I got to stop that heat from coming in from above, right? I would do that as the owner. The question is, how do you incent the landlord to do that when the landlord's not paying the utility bill? And that gets into a policy issue, and part of me says require it, but this is not the kingdom of Ed, right? So it really requires a commission acting within the bounds of the law to do something like that.
Yeah, and the commission is definitely looking into those, and we're very aware of exactly that situation that you've mentioned, Director, that the incentive for the landlord isn't really there. The burden is on the tenant, and it's not realistic that the tenant is going to make home improvements. There might be a little bit of gray area, but I don't have a good sense of how effective it is. The mayor talked about, well, what about, like we used to do up north, put plastic on the inside and outside over jalousie windows. It's not going to do much for temperature, might do something for humidity. That's cheap, and that's something that a tenant might be able to do. It's not terribly attractive, but I would want some data to know, does it significantly help your comfort factor before I encourage people to do it.
Yeah, and I think, that does work. I remember seeing that done in Northeast in old homes, a single pane windows, no storm windows, very drafty. You'd put this shrink plastic clear so you could still see through it over the interiors of the windows. The problem with that is then you wind up cutting it away when you want the window open, right?
It would be a seasonal process. Again, without some data on how effective it is, I wouldn't encourage anybody to do it. And I don't have a good sense of that.
Yep. What I like about things like windows is certainly the attic insulation. To me, that's more permanent. That's more permanent than relying on the customer to not bypass the thermostat control, right? That from a demand response point of view. But I think we need both. But the attic insulation, once you put it up there, it's going to be there for a long period of time, and it's maintenance free. It just sits up there and does its job, right?
As long as you don't get mice in it. But yes.
Yeah. Well, I think mice are a given in this environment, right? Pretty hard to.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
They're full on rats over here.
Yeah. Hey, I lived with flying squirrels in my attic in New Jersey. It took me 25 plus years to figure out how they were getting in, and finally, I'd have to ask the current owner as to whether my fix actually worked. But so I had mice and flying squirrels in my attic. Anyway, we've been on this now for upwards of 3 hours, and this is the first of a number of meetings that we'll have. But if anybody's willing to say, throw a straw man out there now for the types of CO2 reduction, the glide path that you'd like to be on, other than the one that I threw out, there's a straw man, throw it out there now, or certainly give it some thought. We'll schedule the next meeting and come prepared to the next meeting with some alternatives, or an endorsement of one we've already picked. But this is like picking a software package out of the box and saying, I'll take the default setting. If there's anybody has any thoughts, throw them out there.
Is this a spreadsheet provided in the documents that went out? This is this is past and then future projection, correct? On this.
Correct. Kathy, I don't think this was in the backup that was provided. I think this is looking.
No, this was just my own work file.
Right.
Because Ed, you gave us the 2005 and the 2019, and then I started the glide path from there.
Right. So, and to give people context on how we came up with that 2005 number and the 2019, these numbers weren't calculated back then. So what we did was we looked at the sources of energy as best we could determine them, and then we used some kind of standard multipliers by resource type as to what the CO2 emissions were probably from those units. Because we were not measuring CO2 emissions in 2005, but we kind of knew where the power was coming from, and you use standard numbers to figure out what the number likely was.
What's our current number? What's our current percentage for 2022?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I know we looked at it recently, so I can get it before the next meeting.
Okay.
And well, and plus two, right? So 2025, Stanton falls off, so it's probably going to be much lower than this 50% that you see here. I think Stanton's a big percentage of that 248.
Yep. Now, the Stanton numbers, I believe that OUC has given us their actual CO2 numbers because they report those to the DEP or EPA in their annual numbers. So they would adjust those for their gas burn and coal burn, so it'd be accurate.
And Ed, if it helps, I can provide you with this if you want to share it.
Yeah, please do. That would be helpful. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much. One last question is, does Horizons Energy have a website?
Yes, horizons-energy.com.
All right, thank you very much.
So, so to the committee, when you do resource plans, particularly in this age, community involvement is an important element, right? Our pathway or access to the community for input is through you. You should give some thought as to how you all work and as an advisory board and say, how do you know what the rest of the community wants? So do you want to have a public forum? Do you want to just literally talk across the fences in the backyards? Do you want to do this at neighborhood associations? But there's any and all of we obviously can't bring Horizons into every one of those meetings, but I think it's important that you feel confident that what you're bringing to the table represents what the community would like to see, right? And I know the commissioners, vice mayor and mayor will be doing something similar when we finally get to a presentation discussion at the commission level. We want to make sure that if people want to have input, that they have an opportunity to have input to that plan. So we wouldn't want this to be perceived as something that the advisory board came up with, or that the director came up with, or that, in all fairness, Commissioner McBoy came up with, right? We want people to say, hey, there was a group think to this and a consensus on what it should look like.
All right. Well, as part of the neighborhood groups, I can definitely pitch the idea of having some kind of public forum that everyone gets involved with and invites their neighbors to. That would give us one segment of the population. There's also the other segment that are usually mainly renters that aren't always active in neighborhood groups like that. So maybe another style of public forum for those. I know a lot of people I speak to, just off the cuff here, is that all they care about is price. And then other people, I've done informal polls on the Nextdoor app, and I presented the idea of the city purchasing solar power versus themselves, the neighbors and the residents buying solar panels. And they say, oh yeah, it's great if the city does it. I'd be willing to pay a little bit more knowing that I'm having green energy coming through. But again, that's a very small poll. It's not indicative of anything really. Was it 27,000 residential customers? Or
yes, yeah. 27,000,
like that.
27,800, yeah, 27,600, something like that.
So yeah, I mean, I'll do my part from my angles and bring forward my findings with as much data as I can. So you can count on me for that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you can encourage
I think the
everyone else,
commission is likely to do that. And I would just like to comment that it's music to my ears. I've been interested in these things since 1970 something or other, 80s certainly. And it is quite exciting to have a group of people who are willing to spend 3 hours of their time and donate it to trying to help guide this process, make it economically reasonable, make it environmentally as desirable as possible, and take advantage of the fact that we own our utility and have different flexibility than an investor-owned one might have. So I really appreciate the work that all of you are doing.
Or one thing we haven't thought of is we can take about 1,000 of our residents and give them those little science kits you have, Commissioner, and have them all spinning some kind of some mechanism to generate electricity.
There you go.
Have it on a volunteer basis. I don't know what kind of capacity we can get out of that, but you know.
Yeah, it's pretty limited, but it has been helpful for getting people to realize how different a tungsten light bulb is from an LED light bulb. It's quite striking. It surprised me. You'd think I would have known. It's one thing to feel it in your hand as you switch back and forth and see the light difference. But that's still relatively minor in terms of energy savings, but it's awareness.
Exactly. Does anyone have any final questions for Kathy Jones and the Horizons Energy Group? When do we expect to have our next meeting? Is there a penciled in date?
We have not penciled in anything.
Okay.
I was frankly, look for some guidance from you. I would suggest that we, work at this diligently, maybe 2 weeks from now, type of thing. We don't want to drag it out, months, because obviously Horizons like to wrap up their work, and Commission would like to get a recommendation, because then they've got their discussions too.
So to understand correctly, the goal or homework assignment for the board would basically be to engage the community and find out what their desired carbon footprint goals would look like, and also in terms of cost perspective, if they're willing to go all out and have higher rates versus a middle ground, as it were.
I think that's a good place to start. I would probably shy away from saying, hey, do you want, X type of power plant versus Y type of power plant versus Z? But I think if we talk about in terms of carbon footprint reduction and goals, that will then drive in the model the types of technologies. And frankly, I think it's all going to come down to more solar and battery. But I think that's a key thing to ask the community, what the glide path is that they'd like to have. And I would say, echoing the comments about, similar to the parity concept, that I would not choose a glide path that was less aggressive than the one that FPL would choose. We should.
That was an interesting point.
We should lead. We should be leading.
Right. And I think that's also a very interesting way to present it, because I do think that there's a certain amount of pride in our system aspect. Economists do that kind of analysis. Hey, what's it worth to you to have X? And there are ways to get at that. Resource economists do it a lot. And I don't suggest we do a study, but the idea, hey, do you think, would it be worth it to you a little bit to beat FP&L's glide path to carbon reduction? And is that something that you think maybe has value to the city in terms of bringing in more progressive businesses or whatever? I think that's the FP&L comparison is kind of a cool idea.
Do we have a document that shows what their glide path looks like? And can that be distributed to the board members?
I do. There's this carbon tracker website that I go to, and it lists out what the individual utilities carbon goals are. So it's public information.
Cool. And I think FP&L, I seem to remember reading fairly recently in the last couple of months that they have gone quite aggressive on it.
Yes, they have. they've made some very aggressive statements and because they're moving to a hydrogen environment. But that is also going to raise their rates. So they're going to be effectively what they're going to be doing is they're going to be making their own hydrogen to burn in their own power plants, and they're probably going to take the hydrogen production capital investment and put that into their base rates.
Yeah. Are they planning to do the hydrogen production from solar or other renewable to split water, or they have some other scheme?
You know, I don't remember exactly how they were going to do it. But I think they're going to use a lot of solar to do it.
Sounds like they may be doing that then.
And they're going to want to do it right, you know, proximate to the power plants, because they're not going to want to build a hydrogen distribution system. They're going to want to make the hydrogen right at the plant. And they're going to experiment with blending the hydrogen into the natural gas fuel supply to those turbines.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
And
the good part is if you are using the solar to produce your hydrogen that way, that is a very effective form of storage. You skip the whole battery part. You just crank on it while you've got the sun and hang on to the hydrogen when you don't have the sun.
Correct. Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, that completes our agenda for tonight, and I'll ask Suhey to set up a meeting for 2 weeks hence.
All right, well, I don't think it completes the agenda. I think it just completes the presentation portion.
Okay.
We still have one more
That
thing.
is correct.
Yeah. Yeah, but I appreciate the presentation and all the time to take to answer and field questions.
So I think can we release Horizons?
I would say yes. Thank you for coming.
So
Okay,
Greg-
and Ed, I'll follow up with you and send you that CO2 spreadsheet, and I'll add a second sheet to it that shows the goals for the utilities in Florida.
Great, thank you. And I'll get
You're
that out to the advisory board committee.
Great.
Kathy, thanks for jumping in, and everyone, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Night.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, moving on, do we have any public comments that came in from online? Suhey?
No, nothing at all.
Okay. So the next just official item of business is just some housekeeping to approve the minutes from the December 15th, 2021 meeting. I guess I will looking for a motion to approve. It should be in the backup materials you got from Suhey.
I wasn't here for that, so I don't think I'm relevant to this conversation.
That's fine. Good. Would anyone else like to make a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes from the December meeting.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 All those opposed? Okay, minutes approved. All right, seeing we have no unfinished business, no new business, do we have any board comments?
No comment from me.
Okay. Last chance, going once, going twice. All right. Our board liaison, you've had the floor for a while. Do you have any additional comments?
No. Thank you for indulging me with so much time to help guide the conversation.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for putting this together. And since there's no additional comments, I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Second. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Till next time.